Welcome back to The Proof and welcome to the Best of the Proof 2025 Part 1. Before we jump in, I want to wish you all a Merry Christmas if you celebrate Christmas, and if not, a very happy festive period ahead. And I want to say a heartfelt thank you for your engagement, your encouragement, and for sharing these episodes with friends and family over the course of 2025. Because of you, the show continues to grow across Spotify, Apple, YouTube, all the places, and for that, I am tremendously grateful. Most importantly, we are continuing to attract world-class scientists, and I already have an incredible lineup locked in for 2026, including several roundtable episodes where we will dive deeper into major topics with multiple experts at once. Today, we're revisiting some of the most meaningful clips of the year, from protein and the plant versus animal debate to seed oils. Yes, snuck seed oils in again, longevity nutrition, the microbiome, and more. Let's dive into the Best of the Proof 2025 Part 1. In this episode, we'll evaluate Dr. Lyon's claims about protein sources, specifically the role of leucine, and whether or not we should be making value judgments about protein-containing foods based on their leucine content. We'll also double-click on this idea that animal protein is superior to plant protein due to differences in amino acid profile and or bioavailability, and this insinuation that you'd need to overconsume calories to get enough protein from plants. But first, please make sure you hit like below and subscribe if you're not yet subscribed here on YouTube. We've hit 100,000 subscribers recently. Who knows, we could hit 1 million subscribers in the next few years. So Dr. Lyon starts out saying that sometimes she wakes up and chooses violence and is going to give us hard, fast biological numbers. It's the hard, fast biological numbers that I want us to pay attention to today. Dr. Lyon sets up the conversation by establishing that it's important to consume 2.5 grams of leucine to trigger what's known as muscle protein synthesis, the process our bodies use to build new muscle tissue. She then uses this to make value judgments on foods. If they contain 2.5 grams of leucine for a small amount of calories, that equals good and seemingly is worthy of being in her recommendations. And if not, well, the insinuation is that they're not good, at least for building muscle. It sounds like a straightforward framework for evaluating foods and ranking them, right? If a food contains 2.5 grams of leucine for X number of calories, you're in this list. 2.5 grams of leucine for X calories, you're in that list over there. Go to your room, quinoa. You've been a bad boy. Let's entertain Dr. Lyon's premise for now that we need to focus on getting 2.5 grams of leucine from single isolated foods to grow muscle. And then let's take a closer look at how the broader field of nutrition science views this topic today and where I think Dr. Lyon's view could do with a little upgrading. First on Dr. Lyon's list of leucine-rich foods is whey protein, which she rightly states contains 23 grams of protein and provides 128 calories and over 2.5 grams of leucine. From a nutritional standpoint, no argument here. She then refers to a list on screen we cannot see that presumably shows the amount of calories you would need to consume from a variety of animal foods such as milk, beef, etc. to get 2.5 grams of leucine. Here's where the story or evidence that's being presented to you is a little incomplete. Just as you can get 2.5 grams of leucine by consuming roughly 130 calories of whey protein, protein derived by processing dairy, you can get 2.5 grams of leucine from 130 calories of soy protein isolate or 130 calories of pea protein isolate. Anyone can verify this by using the Chronometer food tracking app, which uses the NCDDB food database, one of the world's most comprehensive food and nutrient data sets, which for most foods provides a full amino acid breakdown. Why didn't Dr. Lyon mention soy and pea protein are equivalent to whey protein? If she is judging foods here based on their leucine and calorie content, and her prerogative was to truly share hard biological facts, they seem a little incomplete to me. Is the incomplete nature of these facts purposeful, or an oversight? I don't know. I hope it's not purposeful, and generally my goal in life is to assume the best in people. Next up, Dr. Lyons says you would need to consume 372 calories of soy to get 2.5 grams of leucine. My assumption here, given that soy is an umbrella term for a number of different foods with varying nutritional profiles, is that she is referring to soy milk. If so, yes, it would take 4 cups of soy milk, which is roughly 370 calories, to get 2.5 grams of leucine. But soy milk is just one of several soy foods. And I doubt anyone in their right mind is thinking of drinking 4 cups of soy milk in a single meal. What Dr. Lyon left out is that 260 grams of tofu contains only 270 calories and 2.5 grams of leucine. That's a reasonable amount of tofu that someone could conceivably consume within a meal that contains a perfectly reasonable amount of calories. As you'll hear later, on her website, she's quite happy recommending servings of animal-based proteins that provide 300 to 400 calories. So overlooking foods like tofu here can't simply be a calorie issue. Again, I'm not really sure why this wasn't made clear by Dr. Lyon, and I say this with all due respect, but I do have to wonder, perhaps she hasn't looked at the nutritional profiles of plant-based foods like tofu, like tempeh, etc. Dr. Lyon then goes on to make a specific comparison between quinoa and chicken breast. And I'm not just cherry picking this. This seems to be a regular comparison that she makes, as you'll hear in this other video that I'll play now that was sent to me on the day of recording this.
If you choose to eat plant proteins, let's pick soy or chickpea, or my favorite is quinoa. That's 1,100 calories in 6 cups of quinoa at one time to stimulate your muscle. Go ahead. I just don't want us to argue about it.
It's curious to me that Dr. Lyon likes to compare chicken to quinoa when there are many other plant-based foods that are far more protein dense. After all, over 70% of calories in quinoa are coming from carbohydrates. This actually reminds me of all of the beef versus broccoli or beef versus peanut butter comparisons that you may have seen online. In my view, unhelpful comparisons that are really designed to make a beef, or in this case, chicken, look good. These are called straw man arguments. You compare something that you have an emotional attachment to with a food that's quite easy to knock down, an easy beat, so to speak. If chicken is so superior, why create a straw man argument in the first place? Why not compare it to 260 grams of firm tofu, 175 grams of tempeh, 65 grams of TVP, 50 grams of wheat gluten, which is used to make seitan, or 100 grams of mycoprotein. These are all plant or fungi-based protein sources that provide 2.5 grams of leucine in anywhere from 190 to 330 calories per serve. Furthermore, and more importantly, we need to keep in mind that you typically eat all of these foods within the context of a meal, which is another problem I have with Dr. Lyon's facts and her framework here. Not only are certain foods being left out of the conversation, but she is overlooking that what really matters here is the total protein content of your entire meal, not an individual isolated food. Even if, God forbid, you consumed a smaller portion of one of these foods that I listed, which would provide less protein and calories, you're also getting protein and amino acids like leucine from the other foods that you are eating. And it's the total nutrition from that meal that matters. For example, so you know I'm not making things up here, let's consider the following meal, which is entirely realistic, something many folks eating plant-based meals would regularly make. 175 grams of firm tofu, half a cup of brown rice, let's say a handful of pieces of broccolini to get the greens in there, a cup of raw greens, and you can consume those fresh or cooked, half a cup of cooked mushrooms, and a couple of tablespoons of hemp seeds for some healthy fats. This meal that I've just described provides around 460 calories. That is within most people's calorie budget. It contains 34 grams of total protein, 2.5 grams of leucine, and importantly, 9 grams of fiber, which is a nutrient that is associated with lower risk of chronic disease that the average American and Australian is under-consuming by a long way. And if you wanted to go ahead and make this lower calorie and lower carb, you could remove the brown rice, bump up the tofu to 200 grams, and you'll still get 35 grams of protein, 2.5 grams of leucine, and 8 grams of fiber in that meal, now for only 360 calories. The point being that at a meal level, you don't have to consume 260 grams of tofu to get enough protein or leucine. And this is where Gabriel's framework falls down. If we were to isolate 175 grams of tofu, we would see that it contains 21 grams of protein and 1.7 grams of leucine. Based on Gabriel's position, that would make this an inferior protein source. But yet, as I've just shown you here, when you include this as part of a meal where other foods also contain protein and leucine, this becomes a non-issue. It is interesting to me that, Peter Attia and Andrew Huberman and Rhonda Patrick, even Mark Hyman, are not speaking and sharing the results of these clinical trials that we've walked through. I've really never seen them discuss them at any length. And I'm also interested in a lot of these acute single meal muscle protein synthesis studies, which don't seem to be translating into the things that people really care about.
Yeah, and I've seen that so much in this space. I mean, I'll bring up Lane Norton, my buddy Lane there, who, very similarly, I remember when the Heavy Lorraine, that Brazilian study came out, it was months and months before he ever mentioned it. And he's somebody who I would view as maybe having a bit of an animal protein bias there. And it's just like, that's big news. I would take it as big news. Like, why would that not be, forward facing? But it was a lot of pressure from people like maybe yourself, myself, others in the comment section asking for him to comment before it eventually got to that point. Yeah,
I think it's an unsexy, unfavorable study result at the end of the day, because there is an inherent bias in our society towards animal protein. So it's not the kind of study result that people necessarily want to hear. So there's that. But I also, to Lane's credit, I do think I think he's different to Peter and maybe Andrew, maybe Rhonda, in that he has since come out and said at these higher protein intakes at 1.6 grams per kilogram, there doesn't seem to be a difference between animal and plant protein, where I rarely hear Lane acknowledging the benefits of plant protein is when we look at chronic disease risk.
Yeah, I would, you've done a couple of videos on that.
So he gives lip service to the strength and the hypertrophy, but he doesn't speak to the fact, and guys, this is actually a great thing, because the way I see it is it's great news that plant protein can be just as anabolic as animal protein. Why? Because there's so much evidence suggesting that when you swap calories from animal protein for plant protein, you're reducing your risk of so many different chronic diseases that we would all rather avoid, right? So it seems like a win-win to me, but I've even seen Lane try and twist data like the Maximova study, which I know you've kind of double-clicked on a number of times.
Many times, yeah.
But it seems that Lane is not prepared to support the statement that people would benefit from consuming less animal protein and more plant protein for these other outcomes outside of strength and outside of hypertrophy.
Yeah, one classic example of that will be the Maximova study, which you actually discussed with him on a podcast, if I recall. And this was a study out of Canada that he often references, where they looked at red meat intake, both processed and unprocessed, and cancer risk, but in the context of either low, moderate, or high fruit and vegetable intake. And basically they found that if you're consuming plenty of fruits and vegetables, and I can't recall the exact number of servings there, that unprocessed red meat was not associated with a higher risk of cancer. But some issues that I would take with this, and I know you brought them up, is that for one, the high meat intake was less than a serving a day. It was maybe 500 grams a week or so. And usually when it comes to cancer risk, or at least colorectal cancer risk, we're looking at least 100 grams a day, or about 700 grams a week. So it was certainly falling south of that. Now, in addition to that, they pooled cancers together. So they looked at total cancer risk, and they looked at 15 cancers lumped together. And when we look at unprocessed red meat intake, it's most strongly associated with colorectal cancer and potentially associated with a few other cancers like pancreatic or prostate. And so it doesn't make sense to conclude that, oh, there's no risk because it didn't increase your overall cancer risk, when it could have increased colorectal cancer risk, but because it didn't affect all these other cancers, you just don't really see a result there. Plus, you're eating a lot of fruits and vegetables, which might lower risks of other cancers. And so I don't like the framing there. Now, what I particularly dislike, where he goes beyond just the cancer discussion, is he often uses that to suggest that if you're eating plenty of fruits and vegetables, unprocessed red meat is not problematic, full stop. There's no discussion of cardiovascular risk. There's no discussion of all-cause mortality or other outcomes. So it doesn't make sense.
So there's two real big problems there, or three. One is this was specific to cancer, so let's not extrapolate it outside of cancer. Two, the subjects in this study were not consuming a lot of red meat. So let's not extrapolate that to red meat doesn't increase risk of cancer, because like what dose are we talking about at all? And three, the strongest evidence for red meat associating with cancer, like to your point, is colorectal cancer. And we might not be seeing that effect when you just lump in all other forms of cancer.
Exactly.
To that. So how do you interpret that study?
I mean, I don't think there's much to interpret, to be honest. It suggests that, look, at that level of intake, which is we'll say modest level of intake of unprocessed red meat, if you're eating plenty of fruits and vegetables, then your overall cancer risk does not seem to be higher than somebody who's eating a lower red meat diet, again, with plenty of fruits and vegetables. That is the takeaway. It doesn't tell us about specific cancers. It doesn't tell us about higher levels of intake, so a serving a day or more. And so and it doesn't tell us about heart disease risk or other outcomes. So it just needs to be interpreted in the way that it's presented, and that's exactly what it tells us.
And then, of course, I'm still waiting patiently for Lane to come back to me on that other study, and you know the one I'm talking about here.
The healthy aging study, yes, out of the Nurses' Health study. So this study was looking at something in the ballpark of 30 or 40,000 women in the Nurses' Health study, followed for nearly 3 decades. And they were looking at this sort of criteria that they made for what's considered healthy aging. So this was being free of 11 chronic diseases, being in good mental health, not having cognitive impairment, and not having impairments in physical function. So those 4 things. And they found that higher protein intake was associated with a greater odds of healthy aging. And so when Lane cites that, he's correct. However, he doesn't seem to emphasize how the results were different between plant protein and animal protein. So just to summarize really quick, a 3% increase as a percentage of calories in animal protein from non-dairy sources was associated with a 7% greater odds of healthy aging. From dairy sources, a 14% greater odds of healthy aging. However, from plant sources, 38% greater odds of healthy aging. So it's a massive difference.
And that detail, my memory of his video was that he sort of celebrated this. He did say plant protein did well, but he sort of celebrated this as just a win for protein overall.
And like, this is where, like, you compared to what? If you're comparing some of these animal protein sources, like, whether it's total animal protein or whether it's dairy animal protein, to like refined grains, hyperpalatable, high calorie foods, sure, maybe there's a benefit there. But in their substitution analysis, plant protein beat out every single nutrient they looked at. So it beat out total carbohydrates. It beat out refined carbohydrates, unsurprisingly. It beat out carbohydrates from whole grain foods. It beat out total fat, saturated fat, polyunsaturated fat, monounsaturated fat, animal protein, and dairy protein. Right. Every single one.
And it was actually big. So if you looked at, and you probably have this in front of you, but I believe for a 3% of calorie substitution from animal protein for plant protein. So in that case, it's non-dairy animal protein. So it could be like red meat. swapping out for 3% of calories coming from protein from tofu, for example, it was almost a 40% higher odds of healthy aging.
Yeah, and let's put this in context. We're talking 3% of calories. So in a 2,000 calorie diet, that's 15 grams of protein. So swapping just 15 grams
15
of protein
grams.
from animal protein to plant protein leads to that substantial of a benefit. That's crazy.
And the other thing that I mentioned in my video to Lane was that healthy aging kind of outcome was a composite outcome. Like you mentioned, it included absence of chronic diseases, no impairment in memory, no physical function limitations, and good mental status. And there was a kind of second analysis in that paper after they looked at healthy aging. They looked at those individual kind of 4 outcomes. And plant protein, for every 3% of calories coming from plant protein, increased the odds of not having any physical function limitations by 41%. The same, it was significant for animal protein, but it was 5%. And I think if we're thinking about like frailty, that's what physical function limitations essentially points to. A lot of people have been led to believe that more animal protein, again, means less risk of frailty. But in this study, people that were consuming more plant protein, again, had significantly less risk of having any type of physical function limitations as they aged over that 30-year period. And then for mental status, the only protein that was associated with increased odds of having good mental status was plant protein. So total protein overall was not, animal protein was not, dairy protein was not, but every 3% of calories coming from plant protein increased the odds of the subject having good mental status by 16%.
Yeah, it's across the board, it seems like.
So, I mean, that was my major gripe when I did that kind of response to Lane. And I had thought that he might look at that and, come back and say, you know what, I presented this study as a win for total protein and including animal protein, when in fact, if you look more specifically at the results in this study, it suggests, specifically considering that in general public today, like 60 to 70% of calories from protein is coming from animal protein. So that's like the population we're speaking to here. And this paper to me makes a very compelling case for swapping calories, like you said, 15 grams of animal protein for plant protein, and you're getting these huge results, bearing in mind everything that we've said earlier in this conversation around the fact that that is not going to be a trade-off when it comes to your strength or muscle.
Yeah, and I think what's also worth noting about the nurses' health studies in particular, just to give some people some context, maybe if they aren't familiar, is that this wasn't kind of your typical observational study where they assess people's diet at baseline and then they follow them for 20, 30 years. They actually repeat those assessments every 2 to 4 years, whether on diet or other lifestyle factors. So if there's changes along the way, like they'll note that. It's not just a matter of, oh, this was your diet however many decades ago. They're following them up, and so it's pretty compelling data particularly when it comes to some of the best available observational epidemiology out there.
The average person is starving their microbiome every single day, and in turn, robbing themselves of their best health. Enter 38 Terra's Daily Microbiome Nutrition, or DMN. What's DMN, you ask? Well, who better to explain than 38 Terra founder and gastroenterologist, Dr. Will Bolsowitz.
Thanks, Simon. DMN is a daily prebiotic blend we created to nourish your gut microbes with exactly what they need to thrive. We used rigorously studied ingredients like Actazin kiwi fruit powder and Solnol-resistant starch, both of which have been shown in clinical research to feed the beneficial bacteria, improve regularity, and support digestion and immune health. Of course, we left out the sugar and the unnecessary fillers that you find in so many other products, and what you end up with is the most complete prebiotic that I know of on the market today. In fact, this is the product that I've always wanted for my patients.
Support your gut health today in the most practical, science-backed way with DMN. Simply head to 38terra.com 38tera.com. That's the numbers 38tera.com, and use the coupon code THEPROOF at checkout for 10% off. At some point, I mean, you've explained your kind of overarching food philosophy, which I don't think is controversial at all, particularly to people listening to this show. At some point, you have decided that protein is quite important and you want to have a conversation about it.
Yeah.
In fact, you want to write a whole book about it.
Yeah.
That's how important it is. So walk us through, I guess, the realization that that's what you're going to spend your time on and why that was important.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I think I had another penny drop moment in the middle of my master's doing nutritional medicine at University of Surrey, which is like one of the best institutions in my view, where I was in the middle of a lecture, and the lecturer was a professor of sports medicine. They were talking about ergogenic acids and sports performance and the importance of protein. And he suggested a protein amount that I thought was super high. It was like 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight. Or actually, it was higher than that because they were talking about body composition. And the recommendations, as probably a lot of your audience will recognize, are 0.8 grams per kilogram of ideal body weight per 24 hours. And I thought I'd do the math on how much I was consuming. And at this point, I was eating a very plant-forward diet, getting lots of chickpeas, black beans, all that kind of stuff. But I also work out relatively regularly as well. So a couple of resistance training exercises days per week, a couple of aerobic and a zone 2 training as well. And I realized I was under consuming protein. And when I started increasing that, my recovery improved, my soreness improved, my energy and focus improved. And actually another thing is my cravings actually diminished, because I don't know about you, but like if I'm in the kitchen, I'm always sort of grabbing things, from the drawers and stuff. And that went away. And that kind of led me to realize quite sheepishly and embarrassingly that I'd undervalued protein up to this point, because I was entirely focused on other very important things like deprocessing people's diets, understanding the importance of getting fruits and vegetables in one's diets, and increasing fiber as well, which you can argue are much more important things than protein, considering protein is generally what people have enough of in their diets, according to those dietary recommendations.
So where did you land in terms of what you think is the appropriate or more appropriate kind of target?
So I think it's really individual, and I would say it's at least 50% higher than current dietary recommendations at 1.2. I think that would be a nice baseline for most people. For those who are older adults, particularly over the age of 50, postmenopausal, and people who exercise regularly, I would say 1.6 grams per kilogram of ideal body weight. I keep on saying ideal body weight. That's based on your ideal body weight. So if you're underweight or overweight, you want to be using your ideal body weight that you can figure out using a calculator online per 24 hours, divided in whatever eating pattern you prefer, whether it's 2 meals a day, or 1 meal a day, or 3 meals a day. So I think that would be sensible. The benefits of increasing further beyond that, I think for a general population, may bring people into energy surplus whilst you're chasing a high protein goal. And it also might crowd out even more so other really important elements of a person's diet, like fiber and fruits and vegetables, with the sort of like sole purpose of getting more protein in their diet. So I would say a nice healthy balance would be anywhere between 1.2 and 1.6. When I also was thinking about this, I was reflecting a lot on my experience as a medical doctor in the NHS, working in hospitals, particularly the geriatric ward, and just remembering like how hard it was to get older adults who are in vulnerable states to consume food, let alone protein. And when you look at the protein consumption in the UK of older adults, it is below the current recommendations of 0.8 on average. And there are a number of different studies looking at community-dwelling adults consuming a lot less. And actually, when you push them higher, they have better rates and slower rates of sarcopenia.
These are people that are like 70 years and older.
Yeah. Even above the age of 60, actually.
Wow.
So
they're below 0.8.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And the prevalence of sarcopenia in lower than 60-year-olds across the world is 1 in 10, but there's a range. So that ranges from 1 in 10 to even higher than that. I think it's like 1 in 4. And then above the age of 60, then it ramps up even more so.
What's the average protein intake in the UK for middle-aged adults?
So it really depends on which paper you're looking at. So I've got a couple actually that I can refer to, but it ranges from anywhere between 110 grams per day to 75 to 80 grams per day. So if you,
So it's like 1 to 1.2.
yeah, 1 to 1.2.
Somewhere in there.
But the distribution of that protein is heavily weighted towards animal-based proteins, which is where, again, the play on words, the healthy high protein sort of comes into play here, where, whilst you might be consuming enough protein, within that, there is a distribution of people who are under-consuming and over-consuming. So there's certainly people that could benefit from having more, and there's certainly people that could benefit from having a little bit less and skewing that more towards plant-based
Right,
proteins.
so you're trying to optimize for two things, like the amount and where you get it from.
Absolutely. Yeah. Those are two things I think would be really important for people to consider. I think it's worth doing a little bit of math and figuring out what your personal protein requirements are. And the same is for male and females, by the way. It's based on a weight. And I would also base it on your activity levels as well. The protein requirements for pregnant and breastfeeding women are also slightly higher. And I think we've landed on 1.7 for that, which again is above the recommendations that are currently in place in the UK. And I've gone through this with my wife, actually. It's quite hard to get enough protein in a day when you're looking at that high level, but I believe it is worth it.
I think when some people hear that they should be getting, around 1.6 grams per kilogram of protein, particularly with the message of eating more plant protein, there's almost a knee-jerk reaction of that's going to mean way too many calories.
Yeah.
So I want to make sure we get to that piece, because I'm sure that's something that you've thought about. Before we get to that, though, why do you think there is low protein kind of recommendations and philosophy out there, and people have no doubt come across it online, where they'll see information that suggests that, well, actually for healthy aging, it's better to protein restrict?
Yeah, a couple of things. So most of the protein recommendations are based on nitrogen balance studies. And there was a systematic review that I'll make sure that I send to you of 19 studies looking at nitrogen balance. And their recommendations accurately will recommend anywhere between 0.7 and 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight per 24 hours. These nitrogen balance studies, although they are really well done, like in metabolic wall chambers, and you have to measure everything like skin sloughing off and urine and feces, they're very hard to run. They're generally quite short, and they can underestimate someone's protein requirements over different stages of life. And because we're using a particular cohort of people as well, it's hard to get estimations for pregnant ladies and older adults and those with sarcopenia, as an example. So whilst they are accurate and I understand why they are in place, I think that is a big pitfall. And it'd be great to get your opinion on this as well, of how the dietary recommendations have come about. And there is a process by which they don't just land on the mean, they actually increase it above the mean, and but I think it's 2 standard deviations above the average protein balance. The more novel ways of determining protein requirements are using isotope tracing studies. So they typically use phenylalanine as a tracer. They very colloquially, they put it into like a milk or a drink, and then they measure quite accurately what protein turnover is looking like in the muscle. So that's the balance of protein synthesis versus protein breakdown. And looking at those studies, you can more accurately estimate someone's requirements, and those tend to be of the higher amounts. So I think, sorry, to answer your first question, that's how I think we've got to the lower recommendations. And the other point of I've forgotten the second bit actually. What was the second bit?
Why some people may have come across information that suggests for healthy aging, in fact, there's research suggesting that you should protein restrict, which if they have heard that, they could be sitting here listening to us and then reading your book and thinking, oh, this sounds conflicting.
Yeah. And I've interviewed a few really well-esteemed researchers on my podcast who hold this opinion as well, that we should actually be protein and calorie restricting as we get older.
Like Walter Longo?
Yeah. And I totally respect his work, and I think he's doing phenomenal work, particularly in the realm of fasting and cancer therapeutics and autoimmune conditions. So I think there's some really interesting science there. But I think this is almost going back to the start of our conversation. The difference in opinion between people who practice and actually see people across the clinic desk and in hospitals and have a more pragmatic view versus those who are more biased towards mechanistic studies. So when you look at the mechanism and you under-stimulate things like mTOR, you see a reduction in the likelihood of cancer rates in lab studies looking at rodents generally. So you can understand why this has sort of led to the hypothesis that if you underconsume protein, you reduce the promotion of tumor promoting genes. And this is actually a good strategy for longevity. But in the real world, when you're not appreciating the impact of your immune cells, your resilience to things like common colds and influenza that happens every year, the impact of sarcopenia, frailty, falls, like you can see why that would be actually antithetical to a pragmatic approach to longevity.
All of which, just to underscore, relate back to amino acid consumption.
Exactly. Yeah. We should probably rewind a bit and talk a bit about why protein is so important more generally. But I can see why people sort of get stuck in that mechanistic hole of, okay, we need to be under consuming protein or lowering our protein consumption for longevity benefits. But we don't live in lab environments. We live in the real world. And unfortunately, we need to be cognizant of the stresses of modern living to protect ourselves for as long as possible. And this is where I've become a little bit more skewed, in my opinion, towards a muscle-centric perspective. Not to suggest that protein is all about muscles, but it's a very important component of longevity.
My nutrition philosophy has always been pretty simple. Start with a healthy, plant-rich dietary pattern built around whole foods. That is the single most important nutrition move that you can make when it comes to optimizing your health. But even with a great diet, even with the best diet out there, many of us are still susceptible to falling short on our intake of key essential nutrients. That's where IM8 Daily Ultimate Essentials comes in. Daily Ultimate Essentials was formulated by yours truly, alongside previous guests of The Proof, Dr. Dawn Mussalem, Dr. Suzanne Devkota, and Dr. David Katz. With the right dosage and forms of essential nutrients like vitamin D3, B12, iodine, selenium, zinc, and choline, IM8 was formulated to help you optimize your essential nutrient intake to support your energy levels, cognition, mood, metabolism, and overall well-being. It's also NSF certified for sport, which means that every ingredient is third-party tested before blending, and every single batch is tested after blending to confirm that the active ingredients on the label are in the product in the right quantities and nothing more. In a world where supplements are underregulated and many supplement companies are cutting corners to keep their costs down and boost their profits, it makes sense to me to buy supplements that are NSF certified for sport where possible. For listeners of The Proof, IM8 is offering 10% off your first order. Head to im8health.com and use the code Simon at checkout. That's im8health.com. Code Simon for foundational nutrition that's clinically backed, tested for purity, and built for performance. If you have fallen into this position of deeply having this strong opinion that seed oils are toxic, but you haven't gone and deeply evaluated the research, is your mind playing a trick on you? Are you falling into that position because it helps you explain things in an easy way, or it fits a bias that we have. We all have these biases and fallacies that we cannot see. Again, that's why the scientific method is required. We have to understand that our brain has huge limitations, and so going through the science in a very systematic way is going to be far more reliable. And also, I think this speaks to, I mean, I started on green flags, right? And I was talking about caveats. And now what's just come up in my mind is like logical consistency is another thing that you're looking for when people are speaking. So for example, I know that I debated Dr. Kiltz, and I should have brought this up in the episode, but I didn't because it was jumping around so much. But he spoke about like the stories of people coming into his clinic, right? And that, you know, he believes, like, he can see what's happening to these people when they adopt the carnivore diet. So just him saying that, he's saying that when they come in, you know, what they say they're eating is reliable. Okay. But in the same sentence, if you talk to him about observational studies where hundreds of thousands of people say what they've been eating, he'll say that's not reliable. People have really poor memories. How can they tell you what they ate? So in one hand, he's saying that the person that comes into his clinic, what, are they not humans? Are they not the same person made out of the same material that the humans in these studies are made out of? Do they have, are they different for some reason? Like, what is that? And and in the observational studies, they're not just coming in and tell you what they ate. They're actually using a scientific tool that's been validated, at least to some extent, to act as a questionnaire to find out what they've eaten, that's been validated against weighed food records in that population. That's going to be much more accurate than just listening to someone who comes into your clinic and believing what they're saying.
Right. I think the difference, though, is that when you're a practitioner and you're sitting across from the patient, you can see them in their physical body, the flesh, there's the human being. You know them, what their name is. You've said hello to them. You shake their hand. You see them as a human. Whilst when you're reading a paper, they're just subjects without a face, without a name. They're just numbers on a page. So you don't have that human connection. You don't feel the emotion of when he looks across to his patient and he believes he's changed their life and they're thanking him and they're crying and you've changed my life, Dr. Kiltz. That emotional connection is so powerful that the anecdote gets 10x the credibility that it deserves.
But what's more accurate when you have like 30 years of data and you're doing questionnaires every 4 years? You're getting these people every 4 years to update about their lifestyle and what they're doing. Or you have someone in front of you who is telling you, you know, maybe what they were doing 10, 15 years ago for their lifestyle. We have studies showing like how poor people's memory is. There's that shopping mall study where they studied people and they got one of their relatives for every single person, they spoke to a relative and they got 4 accurate memories that this person had experienced in their life. And then they added in this fake made up memory of being lost in a shopping mall. Right. And they sat these people down and they said, you know, which of these can you remember? And like 30 to 40% of people said they remembered the story of getting lost in the shopping mall.
Right.
So like, again, what the point there is that we have to realize our limitations. And Steven Novella calls that neuropsychological humility. Realize like how many flaws our brain and thinking and logic has and the fallacies that exist and the stories that we tell ourselves. You know, often we convince ourselves of something that didn't even happen. And so trying to reconcile all of these anecdotes are not data. Right? They are hypothesis generating, and there's so much false equivalence online. There's so much speaking of these anecdotes and disregard for actually robust science, you know, that's gone through the scientific method that is far more valid and far more reliable. And so that comes back to an appreciation for the scientific method, which I think is another green flag is like when people talk about the strength of the whatever evidence is that they're putting forward or the weakness of it. So you have logical consistency is if I hear someone like Paul Saladino talk about an animal study here and he's using that to support his argument, and then A couple of days later, he says animal studies shouldn't be used because all of a sudden an animal study is not supporting his argument. That's a logical inconsistency. That's a red flag. You want to see people are being logically consistent with the way that they use evidence. They're talking about the strength of the evidence. They're not just leaning on anecdotes. They're not talking in absolutes. They have context. They have nuance. And so I guess those are some of the tools that, to come full circle, back to your get it off your chest, that can hopefully help people as they're listening to this information and trying to decipher what is fact or more likely to be fact and what is more likely to be fiction or fantasy.
Just again, going back to my story with Martin, when he showed me the episode with Mindy that convinced him to start his journey of going fasting and carnivore and low carb, keto, all that stuff, I said to him, have you listened to people of another position? And then we got our phones out and I showed him a few people that I think he should follow that are making reaction videos and responses to these viral clips, which provide the nuance that didn't exist in the initial clip to show you, hey, actually, that's a big, bold claim that seed oils are killing people and causing everything to go wrong, when actually this person is saying, well, let's look at the data. So I showed him, like, for example, Dr. Ids, who I'm sure you probably follow or at least see his stuff. You've got Matthew Nagra, like all of these guys who are doing reaction videos. You and I have tried a few times. We don't do it as consistently as these other guys who make it their entire social media profile. But I actually think that is one way to move the needle, to have people using these examples of these viral clips, showing what the comments are of people who fall for it, and then going, okay, let's look at the other side of the conversation. So I think there is something there.
Definitely. It's not enough just to say this is the scientific method. That's not good. That's not enough to help people. You have to teach them how to spot the pseudoscience and explain to them why it is pseudoscience. And then over time, being exposed to that, the hope is that they start to pick up on the patterns and trends and signals of pseudoscience.
Right. Before the wheels fall off, because, I mean, I hate to use a single example, but it just comes to mind because it made the news rounds over the last couple of weeks of a guy who started a carnivore diet, likely because he saw a clip that enticed him by a Saladino of the likes, and started eating tremendous amounts of cheese and butter. I don't know if you saw this, but he had cholesterol and lipids trying to escape his body through his skin, basically. Like his hands were marbled with yellow fat and cholesterol, and it was in his feet and his elbows, and people often get it around their eyes and eyelids. But this was 8 months into a carnivore diet where he saw a clip that was like, hey, he's telling me what I want to hear. I want to eat more fat. I really like burgers, cheese, and butter. I'm just only going to eat that. I'm going to remove all plants and carbohydrates. And then 8 months later, he's getting lipids removed from his hands. So like the hope is that you don't get to that place, right?
And the reaction from people in that community was, this is absurd. This is an absurd case study. And it is a fairly extreme case study, the volume of butter and cheese and whatnot. But I think a more reasonable reaction to this is to acknowledge some of the potential downfalls and limitations of that kind of dietary pattern, which you just don't see happening. Whereas at least on the plant-based spectrum, you hear people talking about nutrients of focus. You need to make sure you're getting this, or you could develop a deficiency. Hey, this way of eating is great for reducing chronic disease, but you actually need to plan appropriately because you don't want to develop an acute deficiency. This is the difference. I'm not seeing in that community, unless I'm just not exposed to it, I just don't tend to see as many people sort of putting their hand up and saying, hey, there's ways in which this dietary pattern can go wrong.
Yeah.
And here's a few things to consider. So it'd be nice to kind of see maybe more people in that community kind of taking that approach. As opposed to it just being it's a cure-all. It seems like they think that dietary pattern is just an absolute cure-all for every single condition.
Yeah, that as you said, that made me think of that viral clip of Jordan Peterson talking to Elon Musk about. Did you hear that? Oh my god! Oh my! It's one of the funniest, in the least funny way, clips that you'll ever see. Is Elon Musk mentions that he got a back pain or a joint problem or some sort of like structural issue with his body that needs surgery, and Jordan Peterson's solution is no, just carnivore diet, just eat meat. It'll fix it. And Elon's like, well, actually, I really think this needs surgery. I've gone to see a specialist and I need an operation. And Jordan's like, oh no, but you haven't tried the carnivore diet yet. And Elon's like, no, I like meat. I eat steak, but I don't think eating steak is going to fix my L4 disc bulge, so to speak. It just like Jordan Peterson takes it so far to the extreme that, as you say, it's a cure-all, that it's laughable.
Again, speaks to limitations of the human brain. Jordan Peterson, whether you like him or not, on the spectrum of intellectual capacity, he's towards the higher end. He's towards the higher end. Yet what you're just explaining right there is how affected by the Dunning-Kruger effect he is.
Mate,
so
of all people, he should know better.
He has fallen into the trap of he's adopted this way of eating. It's helped him with whatever condition he's had. And so now he's rushing out to tell everyone that it's the cure-all for everything. Right? And he is like at the top of what they call Mount Stupid, where it's early on when you're learning about something new, as he's learning about the carnivore diet. And that is early on because there's hardly any research actually on the carnivore diet. You develop deep conviction, right? At a point where you actually have very little information, solid information. And then over time, as you learn more and more and more and more, that level of conviction, it never reaches where it reached at that early stage of being at Mount Stupid. So it'll be interesting to see over the next 5 or 10 years if his language starts to change.
But the ultimate irony of that conversation with Elon and Jordan Peterson is that if you were somebody who didn't know who these two men were, and then I told you the guy telling you to eat the meat because it's going to cure everything is a clinical psychologist who focuses on how the brain works, yet falls into the trap that you just mentioned. It's just like, it's comical. It's like a gift from Ricky Gervais. Look at this interaction between these two guys. It's just laughable that the psychologist can't even see his own biases and, falls into those traps that we all tend to fall into occasionally. It does. It does. But how do you get a healthy dose of humility? You've got to have a couple of wake-up calls. I actually feel, I know we've been on this for a while now, but I'll just round it out. I feel like I had my dose of humility when I sort of, I hate to use the term failed, but had a somewhat negative experience on the keto diet after, spending multiple months trying to be on the keto diet for my diabetes health. So my dose of humility came when I realized I was essentially shooting myself in the foot, and that it was okay to be wrong, even though I'd gone to social media and been waving the banner and telling everyone the keto is the way to do it. I ran into some obstacles and hurdles that hurt me and my health physically and mentally and physiologically that I was able to undo through another means that was the complete opposite. So what that could have done to me was make me go down the path of plant-based, hating on keto, but I didn't. I actually realized in that moment that I had all these strong beliefs about something that I really didn't know a lot about, that I was having a good short-term experience that didn't translate to a positive long-term experience. And it left me in a place where I actually feel like I have way more humility because I don't know so much about either now. So yes, I'm a massive proponent of plant-based diet, but I'm also not shooting down the keto diet. I understand it could work for some people, but I just sit in this middle sort of zone where I sort of fluctuate and listen to both sides, and I don't take positions with too much strength, and I don't dig my heels in. I feel like I'm a bit more just fluid and open to these conversations because I realize I don't know much at all.
Honestly, I think it takes an audit at an individual level of the positions that you hold, and in this case, we're talking about nutrition. How much of those positions are driven by emotion and experience versus data? And if you feel like the balance is more towards emotion and less like data, then it's worth examining. And it's such an individual thing to reconcile because deep down you have to want to be a person that has worldviews that are most likely to be accurate. You have to want to live a reality-based life,
Right.
not a deluded-based life.
Right.
And it's so easy to trick ourselves into holding a position and thinking it's reality. This is like the problem that we can fall into. So the only way that I actually see us being able to kind of work through this is really an individual level audit. And getting very, very honest with ourselves about, do we want to really live a reality-based life?
Yeah, a life where you're seeking truth and not just falling for the BS.
Are we being cynical and just doubting things, being reflexively contrarian, as Steven Novella says, because it feels good? It feels good to take the opposite position. Or are we actually applying a healthy level of skepticism in a scientific manner? Let's move on.
That's the ultimate question.
I think we've given the listener a lot to think about there.
Yeah.
And ourselves.
Well, I feel better getting that off my chest, so thanks, mate.
Me too. I recently ran my full labs through Function Health, and I have to say the results were eye-opening. Turns out my ApoB was higher than ideal, probably thanks to a little too much coconut yogurt. I also found out I was slightly low in copper, something that I would have never suspected without testing. On the flip side, my biological age came back 13.3 years younger than my actual age, a calculation based on the work of aging researcher Dr. Morgan Levine. So all in all, I've got a few tweaks to make to optimize my lipids and nutrient status, but overall my blood work says I'm doing pretty well. That's what I love about Function. You get access to over 160 biomarkers covering everything from hormones and inflammation to nutrients, toxins, cardiovascular risk, and more. And all your results are housed in one beautiful platform, all tracked over time. Once you get your results, you can make informed changes before small issues become big ones. To get started, head to functionhealth.com/Simon Hill. The first 1,000 people get a $100 credit toward their membership. That's functionhealth.com/Simon Hill. I recently did a debate on someone else's podcast. I'm not sure whether I should have. I might get you to comment on that after I share this with you. But essentially, I was asked to come on and debate this American doctor who believes the optimal diet for humans is just steak. And so I thought, well, this is interesting. I'd love to know what evidence he's using to support that view. And I was pretty confident in my position going into it, although there is definitely some uncertainty in the exact specifics of diet. But I feel like there is good evidence that supports a broad dietary pattern. And he was blaming the American dietary guidelines for all of the poor health across America. And I pointed out to him, I said, that's interesting because we have quite a lot of data that suggests a very small percentage of the American public, it's 5 to 10%, actually adhere to the dietary guidelines. So I find it difficult to blame guidelines that people are not able to follow. And from my end, the guidelines, there's room for improvement, but there's a lot of evidence behind them. And really the issue to me seems that we can't, the food environment, the socioeconomic status, all of these disparities that are affecting people from adopting a diet that is advocated for and recommended within the guidelines seems to be a more likely explanation rather than the guidelines causing chronic disease. But when I put that to him, he would just go off into storyland. And he wouldn't answer my question directly. And going into the debate, I kind of had this mindset that I don't want to be argumentative. So I probably didn't do a great job bringing him back and holding him to that question and let him go a bit. And I noticed in the comments, at least a lot of people from my community seemed to pick up that pattern of question and then a response with a story. But there were still a large number of people who were convinced by essentially a story without any evidence.
Yeah. So yeah, the debate has been going on for a long time. Like, should we debate pseudoscientists, right? And so I'll answer that question first. The answer is maybe. It depends on a number of variables. One is like, who are you debating and why, in what venue? Who's the audience? Is it moderated and controlled, or is it open-ended? And I wouldn't debate unless you have at least two things. One is you have topic expertise so that you can, the evidence pretty well. And two, what the other person's going to say. The pseudoscience. For example, evolutionary biologists, have many of them debated Duane Gish, who was a creationist. And they, I think they won on points, but as far as rhetorically, they lost the debate. How did an evolutionary biologist lose a debate to a creationist? Well, it's because they didn't know what he was going to say. They might understand evolution, but they don't understand creationism. They don't understand pseudoscience. They don't understand the methods that he's going to use. And so they felt they walked into every trap he laid for them, just because they were knowledge deficit problem, paradigm. They were saying, oh, we just need to give people facts. Saying, yeah, no, it's not what you need to do at all. You need to confront all of the logical problems that are going on and all anyway. So if you're debating somebody on an area where you are confident and the pseudoscience, the methods they use to create their false beliefs, and it's going to be controlled enough that you can sort of hold their feet to the fire, it can be successful. You can make some progress. The problem is, one of the problems, like what you pointed out, is like they're just using it as a platform to tell their stories. And they're not actually debating you. What are you accomplishing? You're just giving them a platform. They're talking at you, or if they're going to give you what we call the Gish Gallop, named after Duane Gish, where he's just going to throw out 100 misconceptions and you'll get to maybe 10 of them, over the course of the debate. It takes a lot more time to correct a misconception to create one. So if it's open-ended rather than moderated and focused, you can't win because they're just going to machine gun you with nonsense. So yeah, but again, it's also a good illustration of what I was saying. Is here you have a guru, right, who thinks that he knows better than all nutrition scientists, that he has the hack, the simple thing, the formula, and that all these scientists are all compromised. They don't know what they're talking about, and they're making a mistake that he can see through because he's got the perspective or the insight, and right, and it's telling people something. Oh, all you have to do is just eat steak all the time, and you'll be fine. And they have stories to tell, right? They have these, again, to a scientist they sound ridiculous, but they're designed to be compelling to a lay audience. That's what their point is. Their whole goal is not to answer to facts, not to be held accountable to logic and evidence and science, but to tell stories which support their narrative, which support their position as a guru, which support their products that they're selling, whatever the narrative it is that they're selling. So yeah, that doesn't sound like it was an amenable venue for a debate. If he was able to get away with that. But that's, what I think you have to be thinking of going in. I've done debates. I've done lots of debates. I think I've won them all, to be honest, just, with all due humility. And that's only because I only go into it when those criteria are met. When I think, all right, this is on a topic I know inside and out. I know the other side. I can almost tell them what they're going to say before they say it, which is very effective. If you undercut their position before they even have a chance to lay it out, then they look foolish, or then it throws them off their game. You got to be operating at that level. Otherwise, you're probably going to get overwhelmed with nonsense.
I think that it will be helpful to go through some of the mechanisms, some of the ways that linoleic acid affects physiology, risk factors, because people will still be exposed to these other claims online around inflammation, around cholesterol or blood glucose. So perhaps we step through some of this, and maybe we start with inflammation. Why do you think that there is this idea out there that linoleic acid, this omega-6 fat, in seed oils increases inflammation?
Well, the standard, the story is, so linoleic acid, omega-6 fatty acid, can be made into arachidonic acid, which is another polyunsaturated, very important polyunsaturated fatty acid in our tissues. About 1 to 2% of the arachidonic or linoleic is converted to arachidonic acid. So arachidonic is 20 carbons, 4 double bonds for the chemists out there. Linoleic is 18 carbons, 2 double bonds. So you have to add 2 more carbons and 2 more double bonds to make arachidonic acid. And arachidonic acid itself is the precursor for a wide variety of other metabolites, what we call oxygenated metabolites, prostaglandins, leukotrienes, and then some other things from cytochrome P450, et cetera. These are hundreds of molecules are made. They're called oxylipins, and these are some of them are pro-inflammatory. Some of the molecules that are made from arachidonic acid are pro-inflammatory, and we need them for inflammation when we have an inflammatory insult. And therefore they got labeled, the entire class of omega-6 fatty acids got labeled as pro-inflammatory. Without realizing that as time goes on, we've discovered more and more, and that actually some of the metabolites of arachidonic acid are anti-inflammatory. They oppose, the body is an amazing, complex, interactive system where one insult leads to the development of the products that will slow it down. I mean, there's a whole discovery of things called resolvins and protectants, which mostly come from omega-3, but there are some that called lipoxin A, which comes from arachidonic acid, and it suppresses the inflammatory response. So it's just far too simple-minded to say that the omega-6 fatty acids are pro-inflammatory. In fact, when people have actually looked at randomized trials, asking the question, if I give more linoleic acid to people, will there be an increase in inflammatory markers in blood? The answer is a resounding no. There is no increase in inflammatory markers when they look at meta-analyses have been done of these studies. There's no increase, and it's been published many, many times. But that does not stop, somehow, it does not stop the idea that's out there in the world that these are pro-inflammatory. It seems like no amount of evidence is going to turn this ship around, which is very depressing. But they're not pro-inflammatory. So put that one away. We can talk about the actual data if you want to, but I think that is the big one.
I think it's important for people to understand that those clinical trials you're talking about, they have actually fed people in a controlled environment seed oils themselves. So I have, just to kind of emphasize and underscore what you just said, I have a quote here from another review, separate to the review that you did with your colleagues. Another review has recently come out. I'll put it in the show notes, kind of tackling a similar question. And they say a systematic review and meta-analysis of 30 randomized controlled trials by Su et al. Involved 1,377 participants showed that dietary linoleic acid from seed oils did not affect blood inflammatory markers, C-reactive protein, interleukin-6, and tumor necrosis factor alpha. So this is the highest quality evidence that we have, where you're in the most controlled manner, possible that for us to utilize. We expose people to seed oils and measure these known inflammatory markers, and we're not seeing a change. So it almost seems, Bill, like textbooks and blog sites and Google Images need an update, because it's only a quick Google to search omega-6 pathway, and you'll be exposed immediately to this idea that the omega-6 pathway is the pro-inflammatory pathway, and omega-6 pathway is pro-inflammatory, and omega-3 is anti-inflammatory. And that seems very embedded in society.
Yeah, You're right, and people love a bad guy and a good guy, a black hat and a white hat. They think it's, somehow you can't love omega-6 and omega-3. There's something impossible about that, and that's just not true. I've been obviously a big fan of omega-3 for my whole career, and so theoretically, I should be an anti-omega-6 guy. Because, they oppose each other, but they don't. And I've just learned over the years that the evidence says the omega-6 linoleic acid is good. EPA and DHA are good. You should have both. Both of them are good, and that's okay. But somehow it just doesn't, you're right. All you got to do is look at a pathway and think you understand all of biology. And that's just completely naive. The body, it has so many systems. And so when you eat something, it's a whole different thing than when you just look at a metabolic chart on the wall. There's so many pathways that are available to maybe even detoxify, to block the oxidation of products. If we were worried about oxidation of fatty acids, we'd be really worried about EPA and DHA because they got way more double bonds than linoleic has. But we know EPA and DHA are beneficial. So how does that work, right? So people are very simple-minded about this thing. They don't think deeply, and they don't, for some reason, are not willing to process the real evidence that's out there.
I think, it comes back to humility, being able to take the position that you just took there, that there's so much going on at a mechanistic level. We probably don't fully understand it. Requires a fair degree of scientific humility.
Well, even the thing you introduced us with, saying there's no reduction in, no change in CRP when you give more omega-6. There's no change in interleukin-6, another inflammatory biomarker we measured. No change in TNF-alpha. Well, that could all be true, but there could be 75 things that we are not measuring that did get worse. Just because you measure X, Y, and Z doesn't mean A, B, C, D, and E, which you haven't measured, haven't changed. It's just we focus on what we measure. Where you shine the light is where you find your keys. That kind of story.
Which is why you have to then come back and look at heart attacks and strokes and
Exactly.
say, hey, we may not even be measuring the right inflammatory markers here, like you said. Perhaps it does increase some, but what do we really care about? Do we really care about its effect on one single mechanism, or do we care about Paul's risk of having a heart attack? First things first, because we want exposure to the polyphenols in olive oil, we ideally want to be buying an extra virgin olive oil, not straight up olive oil, and not even a virgin olive oil, both of which are higher acidity than extra virgin olive oil, indicating that they come from less healthy olives and also from inferior growing conditions. That's essentially the ranking from best to worst. At the bottom, you have Lampante olive oil, which is a free acidity value over 3.3%, and that's not considered fit for human consumption. Then you have ordinary olive oil, which has a free acidity value under 3%. You have virgin olive oil, which has a free acidity value under 2%. And at the top of the list, the best quality extra virgin olive oil, which has a free acidity value under 0.8%. One of the major benefits of extra virgin olive oils is that compared to regular refined olive oils, extra virgin olive oil typically contains about 4 times the amount of phenolic compounds, 232 milligrams per kilogram versus 62 milligrams per kilogram. When you refine the oil, you significantly reduce the amount of polyphenols that are left in that oil. That said, while that is the typical polyphenol content, not all extra virgin olive oils are equal. You cannot simply see extra virgin on the label and assume that it contains 232 milligrams of polyphenols per kilogram or more, with studies showing that olive oils labeled as extra virgin range in polyphenol content anywhere from 50 to 800 milligrams per kilogram. Now, you may be thinking, why such variation? Well, it comes down to where the olives were grown, what part of the season they were harvested, early, in the middle, or late, how they were processed, and whether or not the bottle actually contains what it says. Yep, a recent report that put well-known extra virgin olive oil brands under the microscope graded some as lampante, which, remember, is a type of olive oil below refined olive oil, not even considered fit for human consumption. In other words, your bottle might say extra virgin olive oil on it, but if the manufacturer is trying to increase their margins, they have been known to dilute the high quality olive oil with lower quality oils. For that reason, I do think it's really important to choose an extra virgin olive oil that is transparent with third-party test results to show the polyphenol content, as well as the results for a few other tests that we're going to discuss shortly. Based on a recent Consumer Labs report that I got my hands on, that third-party tested popular brands of extra virgin olive oil and looked at things like free fatty acid profile, acidity, peroxide value, and UV absorption, all measures of quality, along with sensory testing. There were 3 brands that they approved, all considered high quality with varying polyphenol content. I want to share these for all of the US listeners, and then if you are not based in the United States, I'm going to explain how you can ensure that the olive oil you're choosing is high quality as well. Okay, so coming back to this Consumer Labs report in no particular order, the first was a more mild olive oil, California's Olive Ranch's 100% California extra virgin olive oil. This contains 182 milligrams of polyphenols per kilogram and works out to be 40 cents per tablespoon. It's important to note that this brand, California Olive Branch, does have another extra virgin olive oil called Global Blend Medium, which is a blend of olive oils from around the world. So if choosing California Olive Ranch as your olive oil, go with the label that says 100% California extra virgin olive oil, not Global Blend Medium. For high polyphenols, which is over 250 milligrams per kilogram, the Consumer Labs report recommended Leucine Italia Organic Extra Virgin Olive Oil. This has 299 milligrams of polyphenols per kilogram and comes in at 61 US cents per tablespoon. And then for very high polyphenols, the top pick was Life Extension California Estate Extra Virgin Olive Oil. This one had over 400 milligrams of polyphenols per kilogram. It was a little more pricey at 81 cents per tablespoon. Interestingly, Gundry MD Extra Virgin Olive Oil, promoted by Dr. Steven Gundry, despite containing a very high level of polyphenols, the most in the report, was graded as a very poor quality by the reviewers, and I quote, as lampante, i.e. not fit for human consumption. I also thought it was interesting that Trader Joe's Extra Virgin Olive Oil, a brand that is no doubt very popular across US households, was also graded as ordinary or lampante olive oil based on sensory defects. So if you're from the United States, it's quite easy. Just go to the show notes, choose one of these 3 extra virgin olive oils that meets your budget, and you can be confident knowing that you're consuming a high quality extra virgin olive oil. What were the main findings of this study that you would like to bring to people's attention?
Yeah, their main or primary outcomes here were that those with the highest butter intake, again after adjusting for confounding variables, was associated with a 15% higher risk of mortality compared to those with the lowest intake. And for reference, the highest intake was roughly a tablespoon, maybe just under a tablespoon per day. Now, each 10 grams or roughly 2 teaspoons, because they did what's called a dose response, was associated with a 7% higher risk, if you wanted to get a little bit more precise with dosing.
It's interesting, just to pause you there, that 10 grams in this study was the kind of the high intake of butter. But if we were to think about, I mean, at least what I see on social media now from people adopting a kind of animal-based or carnivore-style diet, it looks like there are a number of people that are consuming a lot more butter than that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, 100%. There's people going way, way beyond that. I also just want to note that higher butter consumption, again, about 10 grams, so that's roughly 2 teaspoons, was associated with a 12% higher risk of cancer mortality, so risk of dying due to cancer specifically. Now, if we move on to plant oils as a whole, so this includes olive oil, those with the highest intake actually had a 16% lower risk of mortality, and that was about 1.5 or so tablespoons a day. And each 10 grams, so 2 teaspoons, was associated with a 13% lower risk. So pretty substantial benefit there. Each 10 grams was also associated with an 11% lower risk of cancer mortality and a 6% lower risk of cardiovascular disease mortality. So across the board, we're seeing benefit here.
That was plant-based oils altogether?
With olive, yes, altogether. So it's I have the list here. It's corn, safflower, soybean, canola, and olive were the specific ones they named.
And then they looked at some of those oils separately, right?
Yes. And actually, before that, just to note, plant oils minus olives, so just those other 4 together, the highest intake was associated with an 8% reduction in risk of total mortality, and each 10 grams was associated with a 12% lower risk. So pretty much the same, actually, if you look at the 10-gram dose as the plant oils as a whole. And then, when they looked at individual oils, canola, soybean, and olive oil were all individually associated with reductions in risk of mortality.
And what about the other plant-based oils?
They were non-significant. I can pull them up here, but yeah, the results just weren't statistically significant. Whether or not there is some level of benefit, like if I look at safflower, I mean, the results suggest there very much could have been a benefit, but it was not statistically significant, and the confidence interval was very wide, which to those listening suggests that the data may not have been very precise. And I suspect that's because the high intake was actually relatively low. It was like a teaspoon. So there just weren't a lot of people consuming enough to maybe see a clear benefit there, if there was going to be. And then corn oil, I would say more or less the same, pretty wide confidence interval, pretty low intake as a whole. So that would probably explain those results.
So was there any results or data from this paper that could help kind of someone decide what type of plant-based oil to perhaps buy at the grocery store or cook with? Did one come out on top?
If we look at the results for olive, soybean, and canola, if we just go on the magnitude of reduction in risk, and I want to be very clear, there's sort of a range of potential values here. I don't want to say that this is absolutely the best one, but based on just the stats that we see here, the canola oil actually may have been the best if they're matched for dose. Olive oil and soybean oil were very similar, both also beneficial. But yeah, canola may have even come out on top.
What do you think the main biological mechanisms are that might explain these results? Is it purely or mostly about the saturated versus unsaturated fats?
That's a huge part for sure. And if we look at something like canola, the fact that it's more rich in some of those polyunsaturated fats, especially the ALA, the omega-3 fat, like that could very well be a factor there. And then with olive oil, depending on the type, I mean, you have to look at the polyphenol content as well, if that plays a role as far as arterial function and whatnot. So it's hard to pinpoint exactly which mechanisms are contributing and to what degree, but we can definitely conclude that the reduction in saturated fat and increase in the unsaturated fats is playing a role there.
Oh, Matt, you can sell me on olive oil though. It's more of a romantic story. But canola oil it's industrially processed. I mean, it has such a bad name. Right, you must find this like pushing a boulder uphill when you're sharing information online about canola oil or other seed oils, and suggesting that these oils are in fact health promoting. They're not toxic. What's that experience been like for you?
Oh, I mean, it's all the time. Anytime I post something like that, I get comments saying I've sold out. To who I don't know, but I've sold out to someone. No one's paying me at this point. I wish. Yeah, like I'll get all sorts of comments about how it's toxic or how, I don't know what I'm talking about. What's really funny is I'll have some people who often comment on my content, sort of praising what I'm doing, but then when it comes to this topic, all of a sudden I'm wrong about everything. It's that back and forth. So yeah, I mean, it's a uphill battle for sure. And at the end of the day, look, if for whatever reason you don't want to consume canola or soybean or whatever, go for olive oil. It's a fine option. I just don't think it's necessarily better than these other options.
Let's double click on diet quality. What does that actually mean? If we were to define that based on all of the research, what does a high quality diet mean by definition?
And it has been defined. So I would say, Simon, a good place to start is that quality is as quality does. What would you want a high quality diet to do from you? And we're talking from the perspective of science, medicine, public health. So, we could argue that a high quality diet is a diet that tastes really good and that you enjoy eating. And I don't disagree with that, by the way. I mean, one aspect of dietary quality is it's a diet that adds pleasure to your life. I think that's legitimate. Focusing on the scientific side of the equation, a high quality diet is as a high quality diet does. So it should defend you against the slings and arrows of outrageous epidemiologic misfortune. It should protect you against chronic disease. It should reduce your risk of obesity, diabetes, hypertension, coronary disease, cancer, all the rest. It should make you hale and healthy. It should make you vital and energetic. It should allow you to feel good throughout your days and sleep well at night. And it should do that for a very long time. So it's something that contributes to your longevity. So years in life, life in years, both fortified by a high quality diet. So that's the objective way of measuring it. And when I talk about diet quality, I'm not talking about my opinion. We're having a conversation, Simon. You ask me for my opinion on any topic, I'll share it with you, making it clear that my opinion is. But when we talk about diet quality, the best way to avoid both diatribe and diet tribe is to avoid opinion altogether and say there are objective measures of diet quality that look at the distribution of nutrients, making sure you get enough of the stuff we tend to get too little of, making sure you don't get too much of the stuff we tend to get too much of, making sure that you have an appropriate distribution of all of the foods that best support good health outcomes, most importantly, fruits, vegetables, whole grains, beans, lentils, nuts, and seeds. And you assemble all those contributions into an aggregate score, and you don't need to make that up, and I don't need to make that up because it's been done already. There are a number of these measures. The one that's most widely used and has been most extensively studied is something called the Healthy Eating Index. There are a number of variants on that particular theme, and this was developed by researchers at major universities in collaboration with the USDA. The current version of that is the Healthy Eating Index, or HEI 2020. And among other things, in large cohort studies, so we're talking 100,000 people or more followed for decades, as goes the HEI score, so goes mortality, so goes chronic disease. So higher scores, less mortality, less chronic disease, lower scores, more mortality, more chronic disease. That's diet quality. And so it's a combination of nutrients and servings of foods, all aggregated up to represent the best character of overall diet pattern as it correlates with the critical outcomes that matter most, mortality and morbidity. And when I talk about diet quality in my own work, we're using that objective measure. We didn't make it up. We derived it from a vast amount of peer-reviewed science, the Healthy Eating Index 2020. And the advantageous thing about thinking of diet quality that way, Simon, is it steers us clear of opinion and ideology. And I have my opinions and I have my personal ideology, and I'm happy to talk about those. But I think when we're doing science, we have to very faithfully differentiate between what we know and what we want, between what is science and what is our opinion. So whenever possible, I sidestep ideology altogether and say epidemiology should prevail over ideology, and we should elevate the science.
I think how you spoke to quality is really important, because often I see a bit more of a reductionist kind of definition or use of the word quality, particularly when one is speaking to protein. And what I'm thinking here is that often you'll see an isolated protein source and the quality based on that single food's amino acid kind of profile, and perhaps how that may affect a short-term or outcome like muscle protein synthesis or even strength, but not also kind of encompassing the effect of that food on longer term health outcomes. And so it's important when we're using the word quality to define what are we talking about here? Are we talking about a single short-term outcome, or are we talking about a kind of more holistic long-term outcome?
And you could argue that both matter, at different stages in your life. I mean, you can imagine, for example, you're a competitive athlete. How you perform today matters a lot. But fortunately, the two are highly compatible for the most part, Simon. And with rare exception, most Americans get far more protein and far more of all of the essential amino acids than we need for minimal requirements. And there's some potential argument for more in athletes who are focused on strength in particular and muscle bulk, so competitive bodybuilders and weightlifters, so forth, may benefit from more. Most athletes focused on stamina probably don't derive a particular benefit from extra protein. But they do derive a real benefit from a rich infusion of antioxidants from a wide variety of plant foods, which favor muscle recovery. So you need the critical amount of protein, but that's by no means the only thing you need. And I'm not just talking about years in life and life in years. I'm talking about, winning Wimbledon today. I'm talking about performance today. Optimal nutrition in the short term and optimal nutrition in the long term are much more alike than different. We tend as a society to fall in and out of love with particular nutrients, and they become either silver bullet or scapegoat, and that's always been wrong. You mentioned reductionism, and I would agree with you. I'm avoiding that. I'm looking holistically at diet quality. But if I were to be reductionistic for a second and give you the one word thing we need to focus on to optimize diet quality, my one word would not be sugar or salt or fat or protein or carbohydrate. My one word would be balance. Because think about it, if you are Inuit and you're eating seal or whale, if you have a massive intake of omega-3, we've all heard that omega-3 fat is really good for us. Well, the Inuit don't need more. If anything, they get too much. Now, does that mean omega-3 has gone from being a good thing to a bad thing? No. It's just if you're getting massive amounts of it, more is not helpful to you. It's coals to Newcastle. If you tend to get too little, more moves you toward balance, and it's a good thing. So when you get more of what you tend to get too little of, it moves you toward balance. That's good. When you get more of what you already have too much of, it moves you further away from balance, and imbalance is bad. It's bad for physiology. It's bad for metabolism. When you get less of something you tend to eat in excess, that's a good thing. When you get less of something you're not getting enough of, that's a bad thing. And those conditions vary around the world. So there are absolutely places around the world prone to famine where there is widespread protein deficiency, and more protein is a critical consideration in diet quality there. Just doesn't happen to be true here, where we all get way more protein and way more of all the essential amino acids than we need. So protein tends not to be rate limiting here. The one word that I would defend as the best single representation of the critical essence of diet quality is balance. And that's because of adaptation. Our physiology needs what it needs. And to be clear, those adaptations vary by species, right? There are animals that can only thrive on a entirely plant exclusive diet. And there are obligate carnivores as well. They can't swap diets. They can't metabolize what the other can metabolize. We're in the middle. We are constitutional omnivores. We've got choices. But I'm just pointing out there's this ineluctable link between physiology, metabolism, adaptation, and dietary requirements. And what all of that points to is balance. Provide your metabolism, your physiology with what it needs, you will thrive. Give it anything other than what it's adapted to thrive on, and you will thrive less.
So if we were to get really practical for a moment here, what does balance look like, or achieving greater balance for, let's say, the average American who is going to step into the grocery store is hearing this and thinking, I'd like to increase my healthy eating index score and be more adherent to that way of eating. So I'd like to eat less of the nutrients that I'm perhaps over consuming and increase my intake of nutrients that I'm under consuming or not consuming at all. And I'm interested in what that looks like from a food perspective for my family.
And fortunately it's easy. Of course, Michael Pollan put it in 7 words, Simon: eat food, not too much, mostly plants. And, essentially, if you translate that into a response to your question, what should I do to fix what's broken? So eat food instead of pseudo food. In other words, get away from ultra processed food where the ingredient list runs off the package, and eat more stuff that comes with an ingredient list that's just one word long, like almond, walnut, salmon, banana, broccoli, anything direct from nature. And emphasize plants, which would be fruits, vegetables, whole grains, beans, lentils, nuts, and seeds. And I would append to that, when you're thirsty, mostly drink plain water. So in the grocery store, spend more time in the produce aisle, buy some cooking grains, get some nuts and seeds, but basically steer clear of stuff that looks like it glows in the dark. Steer clear of stuff where the ingredient list runs off the package. The more stuff you can buy that doesn't come in a package, that would be a good thing too. But, frankly, some good stuff does come in a package, so that's not obligatory. Steel cut oats come in a package, and dried lentils come in a package, and canned beans come in a package, chickpeas, all that's fine. So the package is not the problem per se. But short ingredient lists, ideally one word, and lots of plant foods. And again, this does pertain to that issue of balance, because if Americans were all vegan, and if we were not eating enough legumes, so, again, practically what this means for the typical American shopper is spend more time in the produce aisle, and spend less time in those center aisles where everything comes in a bag, box, bottle, jar, can with an ingredient list running off the package. And the reason for this is we tend in America to eat a lot of meat, and we benefit from eating less meat and more plants. So more time in the produce aisle. We tend in America to eat a lot of ultra-processed foods, which have all sorts of liabilities I think we should spend a fair amount of time talking about. So the more things you buy that have an ingredient list just one word long, foods direct from nature, the better. So it really is all about balance. If we were all vegan and had a very rich intake of a wide variety of plant foods, then it might very well be the case that recommending more of that would not improve diet quality. We'd have to recommend something else. But we tend to get too little fruit in the typical American diet. We tend to get too little vegetable in the typical American diet. We tend preferentially to eat meat as our protein source rather than beans and other legumes. And they have all kinds of advantages. They don't have the saturated fat. They have a high quantity of fiber. We tend to consume too much salt, mostly in the form of ultra-processed and highly processed food. Worth noting, by the way, in passing, that salt intake in America is excessive, and 80% of the salt we consume is not from a salt shaker. It's processed into food. So eating less processed food means less sodium. We tend to get an excess of saturated fat, some of the other unhealthy oils. A lot of that comes to us in processed foods as well. And we get way too much added sugar, and that's processed into just about everything, into everything we eat, everything we drink. And again, if you shift to foods direct from nature, preferentially plants, you're avoiding all of that, reducing your intake of saturated fat, sodium, sugar. And it's not that any one of those is evil either. Saturated fat, there are a variety of different saturated fatty acids. They're not bad. In fact, they're a native part of our diet too. We just tend to get too much, and getting more of what you already have too much of, that's bad. That's imbalance. And sodium is an essential nutrient. As a physician, and I would imagine most of my colleagues at some point in their training or careers have seen this, I've seen hyponatremia. That's a low blood level of sodium. It's a devastating condition. It can be lethal. I've seen patients have seizures because of low blood sodium. It's an essential nutrient. So there's nothing evil about sodium. We must have enough of it. but we routinely get way too much of it, and that contributes to hypertension and strokes and heart attacks and kidney failure and so forth. So it's the excess that's harmful. So, again, balance is the key, and the means to that end for the typical American shopper would be buy less stuff with long ingredient lists and spend more time in the produce aisle.
And if we were to think of an example plate of food for dinner, this could look something like legumes, a couple types of legumes perhaps, plus or minus fatty fish like salmon, vegetables, some type of whole grain like brown rice or even white rice. Is that what we're kind of referring to here?
Well, there's a world of culinary options wrapped around this. So you think about the fact that some large populations are vegan or vegetarian and have been for generations in South Asia, for example, in India. So there are many different regional cuisines in India that are almost entirely vegetarian. Wide variety of dishes based on lentils and chickpeas and different vegetables, some of which are commonly eaten here and some of which are not. Okra. There are Southeast Asian cuisines, Japan, parts of China, other Southeast Asian countries that very heavily feature vegetarian and vegan cuisine. And then there are those variants all around the world. So yeah, you can do an awful lot of things with plant foods, and you can, as a flexitarian, include in the mix there some quantity of fish or seafood, which could be part of a meal or not, some quantity of eggs or dairy, which could be part of a meal or not, some quantity of poultry or other meats, although I do particularly recommend people minimize their intake of beef, and we can talk more about all the reasons why if you like. But lots and lots of options. And I can offer up some direct from the home front. My wife is French, grew up in southern France, brilliant cook. I've been a beneficiary my whole life of Catherine's brilliant cooking, as have our 5 children. And she decided to pay it forward. One of our kids urged her to do this, and she created a recipe website called Cuisinicity.com. So like Cuisine City, but with an I in the middle. Just the simplicity of beautiful, family-friendly cooking, Cuisinicity.com, and it's freely available to everybody. And it's all her recipes, and it's videos showing you how she makes stuff. And she was a busy mom of 5 kids growing up when she developed these recipes. So they're incredibly nutritious, they're wonderfully delicious, but they're also not fancy. They're convenient and things that anybody can do at home. So help yourself. If you're seeking inspiration, hey, I like that idea of eating more plants or more beans, more legumes, but I don't know how to do it. Help yourself to that. But also think about just the richness of global cuisine. There are a lot of major cuisines that feature these different kinds of plant foods in various assemblies with or without the inclusion of animal foods, so that there's a whole world of culinary adventure out there for you if you want to expand your repertoire in this area. Lots and lots of different things we can do. But yeah, we really should be flipping the script. I think most Americans were sort of raised to think that the centerpiece of a meal is meat and everything else is secondary. For the sake of health, both in the short term and the long, and planetary health, which we frankly should be talking about too, is arguably the signature issue of our time, we should reverse that. And the centerpiece should be a variety of plant foods with or without the meat. And you don't need it at all, but if you are going to include it in your diet, it should play a secondary role.
Once sulforaphane gets into circulation, what's happening?
Yep.
So what are the benefits that are up for grabs, and how do we understand that through science? Like some of them, clearly not all of them. This is not going to be a 3-hour episode on sulforaphane. And from there, how have we been able to deduce what is the optimal dose, whether it's a supplement or whether it's consuming broccoli sprouts itself, to deliver what would be a beneficial effect? Because earlier you mentioned that much of these phytochemicals have a kind of hormetic effect where there is a certain sweet spot, and then after that it could have a deleterious effect. So if you could help us understand the benefits that are up for grabs and then how we think about dosing, that'd be great.
Yeah, and I apologize. When you asked that question a few minutes ago, we got off on a sidetrack of talking about myrosinase.
That's okay. We sidetracks are okay. We just bring it back.
Bring it home.
Yeah.
Land the plane, Jed. So translate. What's a dose?
No, we got to talk about the mechanism before the dose, though. I think so. There are many mechanisms by which sulforaphane acts. Probably the most well-studied one at this point is via this so-called NRF2 pathway.
NRF2.
Or NRF2. And this is a pathway that is in all humans, and it is one of the critical detoxification pathways in the body. And sulforaphane acts by upregulating that pathway or boosting it. And what I mean by that is, this pathway is going on in your body, and when it sees sulforaphane, it goes even more.
It's like putting the foot on the accelerator of that.
It's like putting the foot on the accelerator. And one of the things we've learned in clinical studies that we've done in China is that you can keep your foot on the gas pedal, and you don't exhaust the body's ability to upregulate that pathway. We've dosed daily with glucoraphanin and sulforaphane for 3 months and saw really essentially no reduction.
There's no
in the
rebound.
response.
Like if you were then to stop the broccoli sprout supplement, it's not going to have damaged that endogenous kind of production.
Correct. And so this NRF2 pathway is, as I say, extremely critical. It's an upregulation of part of the DNA that leads to production of a suite of something like 500, this is not an exaggeration, but about 500 protective proteins and enzymes. Most of them are enzymes involved in detoxification, antioxidant, and included in that suite of enzymes are the enzymes in the glutathione pathway. Glutathione is your body's most important and most prevalent antioxidant. I know you've got another question, but I want to tell you that there are other pathways too, and some of those.
Wow, I cancel the next podcast. Let's keep going.
sorry, Dan Sofer. No,
but so let's.
I have a lot of questions, James.
He's here.
So, well, I mean, just to kind of butt in there and interject. So this story here is about sulforaphane is upregulating the body's own kind of antioxidant pathway and production of antioxidants, as opposed to being a direct antioxidant itself.
Correct. And thank you for that entree to a little soapbox that I would like to get on. You may be aware of this, but when you take a direct antioxidant like vitamin C and you look at what happens in your body, you take it, it's absorbed. You can see it being excreted in the urine within a couple of hours, and it does its thing. It's the antioxidant thing. So if you wanted to have vitamin C as an antioxidant 24/7, you'd need to be mainlining it.
IV.
Mainlining it, taking it all the time. Sulforaphane, we call an indirect antioxidant. And the reason we call it that is because, as I mentioned, it induces or upregulates these protective enzymes via the NRF2 pathway, but that it doesn't even matter what the name of the pathway is. When you upregulate protective enzymes, those enzymes stick around for hours to days in your body, and they work for hours to days. They're like little Pac-Men. You're too young to. Almost too young to remember Pac-Man.
He's world champion.
I grew up in America for the first 8 years of my life, and believe it or not, and I'm not sure whether I should be proud of this because it's not the healthiest of food, but I used to go to Fuddruckers and play Pac-Man all the time.
I think I saw you there.
We used to all these years later, we're swapping those burgers for Sprouts.
Well,
Didn't see that coming.
In the early 80s, when I was working in Syracuse, New York, in a biotechnology group, almost all of us used to go across the street to a very, very seedy bar for lunch and play Pac-Man and Pac-Man Jr. Mrs. Pac-Man came on. Anyway, so you got these enzymes. They're like Pac-Man. they chomp, 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 and eventually they're going to get destroyed. But it takes hours to days, and so these are all potent antioxidant pathways that are upregulated. So very critical. Just to give you a flavor for some of the other pathways that are affected by sulforaphane, and literally I have a full page in a paper outlining the different pathways. But Doug mentioned heat shock protein a while ago. This is an important protein, we think perhaps in autism and some other conditions. And we know sulforaphane is effective in autism. We're not sure in humans how useful sulforaphane is in upregulating heat shock proteins as a practical matter, but that's a very different pathway that upregulates. We know it kills Helicobacter pylori, which causes ulcers and stomach cancer widely in Asia. And we've done these studies. We did a clinical study in Japan and showed this. Unfortunately, it doesn't kill them all, so they do bounce back. But still, it may reduce the need.
But that could be just an invitation for more testing because they're bouncing back. So you literally have to keep up. It's like, with any sort of treatment, like yesterday's shower isn't going to stop you from stinking today.
It could, but
I want to take note of that. No, I'm just kidding. Mate. You smell great.
I know. I just did some push-ups though.
But is it the NRF2 pathway that is thought to explain the potential sort of chemoprotective or cancer protective effect of sulforaphane?
Yes, the prime factor. But I mean, I just mentioned Helicobacter. That is one of the prime agents of stomach cancer, as you mentioned, in Asia. And so if you can kill Helicobacter and not do anything else, then you're affecting a cancer protection there.
Did you know you're only half human? It's true. Your body contains roughly the same number of microbial cells as it does human cells. But these microbes, specifically bacteria, viruses, fungi, and archaea, are not invaders. They are your most powerful health allies. Which brings us to the first definition today, the microbiome. Your gut microbiome is not just a collection of bacteria. It's a dynamic ecosystem, a rainforest of these microorganisms, bacteria, viruses, fungi, and archaea. Primarily residing in your large intestine or colon, this community is incredibly diverse, with each microbe playing a very specific role in your health. So let's explore exactly how they do that, starting with your immune system. Firstly, microbes educate our immune system more than teachers. Think of them as scholars, training your immune system to distinguish between harmful pathogens and friendly microbes, helping to balance immune responses and reducing autoimmunity. Second, they protect your gut barrier. Microbes ferment or consume indigestible parts of our food that escape digestion in our small intestine and pass into our large intestine, producing specific fats known as short-chain fatty acids like butyrate, propionate, and acetate. Why is this important? Because these short-chain fatty acids, like butyrate, are the peacekeepers of your gut lining. Butyrate, for instance, is the main fuel for the cells lining your colon. It helps strengthen the gut barrier, preventing what we call leaky gut, which is more accurately referred to as increased intestinal permeability. A strong gut barrier helps keep inflammation down by preventing harmful substances from entering circulation. Third, these microbes influence your brain and emotions. The gut-brain axis allows communication between your gut and brain, impacting mood, stress, and cognition. You've probably heard before that 90% of serotonin is made in the gut. And while this serotonin does not cross the blood-brain barrier, it can affect nerves that send signals directly to the brain. Microbes also influence your brain through the vagus nerve and by producing neurotransmitter precursors like tryptophan, which can cross the blood-brain barrier and affect mood, sleep, pain perception, etc. Microbes even influence your appetite and satiety, something we spoke about in a previous episode together. And beyond that, they're involved in regulating cholesterol, insulin sensitivity, and inflammation throughout the body. An imbalanced microbiome, what we call dysbiosis, is linked to conditions like type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, inflammatory bowel disease, allergies, and even neurodegenerative diseases. The exciting part, unlike our genes, which are fixed, our microbiome is dynamic and highly responsive. What you eat, how you sleep, your stress levels, all of these influence the composition and function of our microbiome on the daily. In a matter of days, you can literally shift your microbiome from an ecosystem that is promoting disease to one that's promoting good health. On the testing, and we don't have commercial ties, or I don't have commercial ties. I'm just asking this purely because I know there are so many options out there. And as a microbiome scientist, I have to imagine there are different ways of analyzing stool.
Yeah.
So from a clinical research point of view, like what would the most accurate, valid way of looking at stool be so that if someone's listening and they want to do this, they're going to be more likely to find that gap?
Yeah. So I don't have any commercial ties to any companies either. But I did do a study on this and went through the commercially available kits and looked at what method do they use to analyze the microbiome. And it's all different. Every company takes a different approach for the most part, which is challenging if you decide to use one company and then another. If you send your same sample to two companies, you'll get different results because the methods are different, and different methods will give you different results. So I think that's important to appreciate, is that there's no one, like the output you get depending on your kit isn't the end all and be all for your microbiome. So it's challenging. So there's a targeted approach where you can say, okay, I want to know, do I have these beneficial microbes and do I have these pathogens? A targeted approach, in my opinion, is best. And that's a quantitative PCR-based approach, which, because it's high fidelity tagging, you can get quantitative results. And it's really, you can really trust that data because it amplifies it out of the whole gamish. But most people are not in that group. Most people want to know, tell me what my microbiome is. And so you have to take a much more agnostic approach. You might only do a targeted approach after you already know what your agnostic microbiome looks like. So the agnostic approaches are all relative abundance based. They're not quantitative. So it's all, how much of this do I have, out of 100%, what do I have? And so getting back to the Akkermansia question, that's where if it's really low, anything that there's a limit of detection there. So you may have organisms, but they won't be detected by those methods. The other important thing to note is that a lot of the early tests and some current tests use what's called the 16S RNA sequencing. That does not give you species level identities. It'll only tell you kind of the genus level. Do I have bifidobacterium and things like that. More and more companies are using what's called metagenomic sequencing, which can get you to the species level. It tends to be more expensive. And then there are companies like Biome, which is kind of everywhere, where they take a very different approach, and they use metatranscriptomics. And that actually looks at bacterial functions. That's a very exciting, sort of more sophisticated sequencing approach. However, the sample handling that's required to do that reliably is much more challenging. So I do question how a mailed-in sample, how the integrity of that sample is appropriate for that approach. So no one of them is perfect, but what I tend to tell people is one is not enough. You have to do multiples because on any given day, your microbiome is going to change, right? So you want multiple data points to understand your baseline. And the second is, if you pick a company, stick with that company. Don't send it somewhere else because you're just going to confuse yourself.
Right. Yeah. Did you publish that review of these, or was that more of a private review?
No, I give talks on this.
You give talks on it. So if you were advising me right now, just to make this like really simple, and let's just say I said budget's not an issue, and you wanted me to go out and do a couple of tests, providing you're happy to do this, what would those tests be?
You mean like which companies? Yeah. So there's a new company that is out. I have not actually tested their test, but I know what's in the background. And it's called Jonah Health. And the reason why I'm intrigued by them is because they take an AI-based approach, which other companies have not yet quite embraced, and to essentially make more accurate predictions about your microbiome and what may work for you. And I think AI is going to change how we do microbiome research. So companies that are embracing that early, I think, are probably going to make some more robust discoveries that might be more uniform across people and a little more reliable. Again, I have not actually taken their test myself, but I know what the background is.
Is that because we have a whole lot of data from studies looking at the bacterial composition of different subjects, and that can all be fed now into AI and analyzed presumably much deeper?
Absolutely. And you can also then set your rigor standards for which studies you include into your AI algorithm, right? Because not all studies are equal, and some are, you can say, okay, only studies that have a population size of over 100 people and only stool samples or only biopsies, and you can really sort of parse it out that way and do, I think, at a scale that we couldn't do before.
Okay, so that's Jonah Health.
Yeah.
So I'd start there.
I would start there. And it would maybe be worth, I think, because of Viome's methodology is different than most people's, I think theirs might be worth looking at. Now, what I do say about both of those companies and every other company out there is no one just gives you your microbiome data. They will also give you nutrition advice and potentially try to sell you a probiotic, right? I would ignore all that. I would just look at your microbiome composition and say, okay, I'm just like everyone should have their baseline blood work done and their baseline when you're healthy, not when you're sick. Your microbiome profile should be part of that. So when you get a food poisoning or whatever, you take antibiotics and you're worried, is my microbiome going to come back normally? You know what your baseline was, and you can then maybe tailor it to get you back there faster. So I think just take the microbiome compositional data, ignore all the dietary stuff because there isn't enough data out there yet on that.
So what would someone do with the results then? If they are not using the advice from those companies,
yeah,
like how would the average person look at their results and then be able to say, okay, that's telling me I'm low in this, so I should supplement with that, or I should eat more of this?
So that's probably my primary issue with at-home testing, is because there is no support for individuals in the way that they need it. So every company has created some metric, right? A index, a disease score, a score, that is completely arbitrary. It's just based on a way for people to easily interpret their data. But it misses all the important nuance and sometimes can give people the wrong impression, right? Sometimes they could say, oh, I'm really low, like it's red. And you think, oh my God, but it could be inconsequential in the reality, right? So they go to their doctors. Doctors have 10 minutes of time with them, and they're here with this microbiome test that they don't know what to do. I hear this all the time from clinicians. They're like, we don't know what to do with these microbiome tests. Please tell people to stop taking them. And so physicians, that's who you would logically go to. And that's a struggle because there's enough support. So then people are frustrated.
And I imagine that the easiest thing for a physician to often say in that case is take a broad spectrum probiotic.
Yeah. Exactly. I mean, that's because worse, it does no harm, right? And for some people, by luck, it may help, right? And it gives someone tangible, like they can walk away with. But there's there's a big disconnect there. I have talked to clinics and things like that about personalized care for people who want to do microbiome testing, where I would talk to them, or someone who is a researcher would talk to them and actually spend time, walk them through their microbiome, explain it to them. So because it's a lot of information.
Right, but it's not as simple. What I'm hearing is me getting my results back, saying I'm low on, or relatively low, depending on the test, if it's relative or quantitative. Let's say I'm low relative and quantitative, and then saying, okay, I'm going to go find a probiotic supplement that has A, B, and C.
You could do that.
Okay.
You could do that. And that would be true if you were healthy or otherwise. And it said, okay, I'm completely missing lactobacilli from my microbiome. Lactobacilli are good in general. And so if you took a probiotic, pretty much any probiotic that has lactobacilli, you'd have a reasonable chance of that colonizing your gut and filling in that gap.
Okay.
Okay. So that is important to know. But no one's really kind of done those experiments where they say, okay, this person's deficient in this. Let's give them probiotics for how long? We don't know, for it to colonize. And then what if you stop their probiotic? Does it stay? These are all black boxes still that we haven't done in the field systematically. But conceptually, yes, that would work. If you're missing it and you could then go buy the probiotic, which is what I advocate. I said you should not buy probiotics blindly. You should at least have some idea of what you have and then rationally select your probiotic.
And that's news to me because I had thought that all probiotics were transient. So now this is like clarifying that maybe if you already have great diversity, more likely to be transient, not going to colonize. And what I'm hearing is less of a rationale to go out and just take probiotics for general gut health. Focus more on prebiotics in the food that you're consuming to just continue to maintain that diversity. But whereas if you have low diversity, it might be that taking a probiotic does lead to colonization.
Yeah.
And then back to kind of what we were talking about earlier, the function of the microbiome is the hypothesis there is that you're restoring diversity. So you're creating more of those compounds.
Yeah, there's a sort of approved list of what probiotics can contain, right? It's not, so your microbiome there's 1,000 different of species that could make up your microbiome. And there's, I don't know, 20, 15 approved probiotics. So, and they tend to be lactobacilli, bifidobacterium, things like some bacilli, spores, things like that, but not really what represents the diversity of your microbiome. And so that's because you have a limited selection of microbes, you may be able to just support those. But if you're missing others, if you're missing your important Clostridial species or other, there aren't really probiotics for those. And so for those, that's where you want to figure out how to support those through diet, because bring the levels up naturally because they don't exist in probiotic form.
Got you. And how specific do people need to get there? Is that just more broad dietary guidelines?
Yeah, I mean, we know which classes of microbes, for example, are really responsive to fermentable fibers. Okay, we know that Clostridia and Bacteroides type species, if you eat what's called, we mentioned we had Justin on the show, he really pioneered the microbial accessible carbohydrates as MACs, right? MACs are, everyone needs to understand what MACs are and consume them to support their microbiome. I believe, and we don't consume them much in our diet in general, in Western diets. If our diet was more enriched in those, I don't think probiotics would be necessary at all. I think we could really bring up not just the beneficial bugs, but all the beneficial byproducts.
Which are coming from like nuts and seeds and whole grains and fruits and vegetables.
Yeah, not so much nuts.
Foods.
Well, it'll be like beta glucan, so certain vegetables, asparagus, mushrooms, your quinoas, certain grains. Pectin, like apple skins. So if you're making a smoothie or, peeling things is not good for your microbiome, you want to include those. Resistant starches like green bananas. So there's like lists you can look up specifically for, you can ask ChatGPT, microbial accessible carbohydrates, list them out for you. And because they're not necessarily intuitive as to what they are. So you need those. And you need that in combination with your psyllium and fibers that keep things moving. That's, for gut health, those two together could change how your whole gut functions.
There's a wave of kind of populist nutrition messaging right now in the United States, and you seem to cover it all. And it spreads globally through social media. Some of it kind of sounds promising. Some of it is potentially dangerous. And I want to understand what's really going on beneath the surface while I have this time with you today. At the center of a lot of that conversation is a movement called MAHA, Make America Healthy Again, which is led by RFK Jr. and Casey Means, Kelly Means, names people may have heard of before. For listeners who may not be familiar, what exactly is MAHA?
I think MAHA it's a movement it's kind of like a grassroots movement of people who were looking around and concerned about health outcomes that they saw in the country, our food environment, without maybe even knowing that this is what they were concerned about, but systems in the country that are set up for a lot of people to fail. They were seeing chronic disease rates increase in the population as a whole, but also in our children. And they knew something was wrong and they knew something was off. And I think MAHA was a movement that kind of came in and gave an answer to those problems and helped to galvanize a lot of people who maybe never even thought about public health systems before, who started recognizing, hey, we need to have some say here. We need to improve things. And so, the MAHA movement itself, I think, is very much from the ground up, is a movement of people who are genuinely concerned about the health of Americans and our food system and those types of things. I think from the top, it's certainly a political movement, and it was a political movement for one political party that kind of spoke to a lot of the things that people care about in order to, get votes for that political party.
Yeah, I've seen you say before that the reason that MAHA is so dangerous is that they talk about those things that we all want, what you've just pointed out. But while they say that, their actions are more of a distraction. Can you unpack what that looks like and what that is?
Yeah. So, a couple of things. Let's just talk about some of the things that MAHA talks about quite a bit. So they talk about additives in our food supply, for example. So they'll look and they'll say, okay, our food supply is, let's say, at the high end, 70% ultra-processed food. All of these additives in ultra-processed foods are the problem. If we all agree that that's true, and the evidence doesn't necessarily agree that that's true, but if we all agree that that's true, what would be the solution? And so the solution, if you're trying to design a system that is going to have more oversight over additives in our food supply, would be to strengthen the scientists who are actually overseeing the additives in our food supply. If you want to do something like close the GRAS loophole, which would help to strengthen oversight of the additives in our food supply, you need a strong FDA and you need a strong food side of the FDA. And so this is where it's really important to understand, kind of like, if you're diagnosing a problem, you have to understand what the solution needs to look like. And so that would be the solution. But what we're seeing is defunding of the FDA, and we're seeing scientists being cut at the FDA, and we're seeing a weaker food side of the FDA. And so that is an exact kind of contrast to what the MAHA movement would like to see. And I can kind of run down lots of these. They want to see less environmental toxins, less heavy metals in our food, soil, and water, right? But what we're seeing right now from this administration, which is the administration MAHA aligned itself with, we're seeing deregulation of lots of these companies that are polluting industries. We're seeing a rollback of a lot of environmental regulations, and particularly with like oil companies and things like that are going to increase the amount of heavy metals in our soil and water, and that's going to end up in our food supply.
So it's not that what they care about and what they'd like to see change is different. It's that the way they're going about it is not genuinely rooted or reflected in the best science that we have available to us. And if that's the case, if I'm grasping that correctly, why is that? Why do they not see the science in the same way? And is this them ignoring the science that says otherwise because there are other incentives at play that are more important to this group? Or what is explaining these kind of decisions that we're seeing?
So it's tough for me to answer the question as to intent or reasons why they're doing it. I can speak to what is happening, but I would just kind of be speculating into why they're doing it. I mean, which I can do, but just to be clear, it's my speculation. I would think that the thing with the MAHA movement is that they have really focused on this idea of toxins, of corruption in our public health agencies, of corruption in science itself. And so I think that different factions have different reasons behind that. I think that I don't know that you have the MAHA movement without COVID, because I think that the COVID-19 pandemic really fueled a lot of this mistrust in public health. And they were kind of able to latch onto that and use that to kind of fuel even more distrust in public health in all of the agencies. And, from people who most people don't really know what public health is or what people in the public health world do, right? Because public health is very much kind of like it operates pretty silently. And when it's working, you don't really think about it and you don't know it's working. So for example, when you drink your water out of the faucet and it's clean, you don't think of all of the regulations and all of the public health infrastructure that goes into getting you clean water. When you're breathing in clean air, you don't think of all the public health infrastructure. When you don't recognize an infectious disease that never actually became a pandemic because of public health infrastructure. Think about, the fact that we have a very safe food supply and we don't have a bunch of foodborne illness all the time. So that's public health, essentially. And they're kind of working behind the scenes. So I think it makes it really easy to kind of paint public health agencies as villainous. So to get back to your question though, I'm not exactly sure of the overall intent. But what I will say is that when you have a movement that really gets the problem largely right, but then misdiagnoses that problem in terms of what's causing those issues, then you're going to get the solutions wrong. And that's the problem with this movement is, as somebody who studied chronic disease, their main focus is chronic disease. And as somebody who studied that for 15 years, I could tell you that they're not focused on the main drivers of chronic disease in this country. So, and I can give you a really good example. The number one predictor of health in this country is wealth. So if you want to look at who is most impacted by chronic disease, and that's what we should do if we're looking at chronic disease, we're not all affected by lifestyle-related chronic disease equally. So there's populations of this country that are disproportionately impacted by chronic disease, and that tends to be low income and minority populations. So if you look at income distributions and you look at the highest income bracket versus the lowest income bracket, there's studies to show a 15-year life expectancy age gap for men and a 10-year life expectancy age gap for women between those two distributions. If you look at diabetes rates, twice as high of diabetes rates in the low income populations, 5 times more likely to report poor health. And so, just condition after condition we see is disproportionately impacting low-income populations. So if you want to target chronic disease in this country, you have to target that group that is most impacted by chronic disease. And how do we do that? We do that through public health infrastructures. 2 of the biggest programs that can help, and we know can help from data, are expanding healthcare access and expanding nutrition assistance access. But what we're seeing with this administration is that they've defunded both of those. They've cut almost $1 trillion from Medicaid and, almost $200 billion from SNAP, which is our Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. And so, again, if you're trying to decrease chronic disease, but you don't know the data that I just told you, and you don't know that those public health programs actually directly reduce chronic disease rates, and then you see that it's being defunded, maybe you don't recognize that that's actually going to do the exact opposite of what we want to see, which is decrease chronic disease rates in this country.
On the topic of RFK Jr. and some of the things that have been said in the public over the last month or so, particularly this idea that updated dietary guidelines will not have this kind of emphasis on limiting saturated fat and saturated rich foods. Do you think that will cause harm to the public? Are you worried about that if that change comes into play?
Well, at least what RFK has said in public, or it's been said that he said that in public, that quotations, that it's not so much focusing on limiting saturated fat, but emphasizing that we need to increase saturated fat and eat more beef and more whole fat dairy and more butter and more tallow and more lard. And at the same time saying we should decrease and really try to avoid seed oils, which are the major source of polyunsaturated fats in our diet. So it's really that coupling of promoting more saturated fat and reducing polyunsaturated fat. That's the real danger.
And what do you predict the kind of consequences of that could be if that is the advice that is communicated to the American public?
It's not just advice, because the dietary guidelines are supposed to guide federal food programs, such as what children eat in schools, what's available through supplement programs, and what's served in U.S. facilities, millions and millions of meals per day. And so we know very well that if you replace polyunsaturated fats with saturated fats, tallow, butter, that will increase risk of coronary heart disease. The premise of MAHA, Make America Healthy Again, is fundamentally wrong, that we were living 10 years shorter lifespans back in the 1950s and 1960s. We've made great progress. Heart disease rates have come down by about 80% since that time. Now, many factors were responsible for that huge decline in heart disease rates, including not smoking or reductions in smoking, better control of blood pressure, and some medical treatments. But the change in fat composition since that time has clearly been a very important part of the progress we've made. So we don't want to go backwards.
How do you feel about the current government's focus on, or at least to me, it seems like the focus has been more on single ingredients, at least what's reported in the media, things like Red 40 and seed oils. Is that where you would, if you were part of the government that was given the task of trying to improve the average diet in America, increase adherence to this healthy eating index, change the food environment, is that where you would be focusing your time and energy, or is that a distraction from what you think matters most?
The latter. Yeah, I think it's a distraction. I think, any single dye is just part of a larger problem of too much frankenfood, too much chemistry where real food ought to be. Seed oils are a complete boondoggle. Canola oil is one of the healthiest choices you can make. It depends, obviously, on how the oil is produced. So there's a difference between mechanically pressed and chemically extracted, organic versus not, and there are different versions of these things. But the evidence is overwhelming of the advantages there. And other seed oils are probably better than the oils they're replacing. But at a certain level of nuance, I would agree that we get too much omega-6 fat, not enough omega-3 fat. Oils in processed foods are part of that problem. So, yeah, there's an issue there, but it's being overblown. And frankly, replacing seed oil with beef tallow is a tremendous mistake. It's an environmental mistake. It's a human health mistake. It's taking the situation into far worse territory. So, yeah, it's definitely not where my focus would be. My focus would be exactly where my focus is. If we could do just one thing to improve diet quality in America, I would say let's make everybody vividly aware of what their diet quality is and what it could be. And let's put that information in front of every healthcare professional. How would that reverberate? So I've written a thought experiment on this. There was a time before the invention of the blood pressure cuff when the House of Medicine already knew how important blood pressure was. We knew that it was a major contributor to heart attack and stroke, but we had no convenient way of measuring it. We could measure it with intra-arterial catheters, which are quite painful. So, they were only used in extreme circumstances. And by the way, we still use them in extreme circumstances. Now I've put them in over the course of my career. But we had no convenient way of measuring blood pressure, so we didn't. We just knew that in general it's a problem, and if your blood pressure is high, you're at increased risk of heart attack or stroke. So how did we know that your blood pressure was high? We waited until you had a heart attack or stroke because we couldn't measure it beforehand. So when you had your first stroke, we said, I bet your blood pressure is not so good. And maybe then we put in an intra-arterial catheter when you were in the hospital. The advent of sphygmomanometry, the non-invasive measurement of blood pressure with a blood pressure cuff, was a massive transformation in everything about medicine. Prevailing clinical practice, medical education, qualifications, credential, everything. Because we suddenly had this critically important upstream information, and we had to be able to deal with it. So if physicians had not formerly been trained in how to respond to blood pressure numbers, they had to learn. And if medical education didn't address the critical importance of measuring systolic and diastolic blood pressure, they had to change medical education. And if population-level health programs were not being credentialed based on how routinely they measured and managed blood pressure, that had to change, and everything did change. It was absolutely transformational, and none of us can imagine a world now where blood pressure isn't routinely measured. We're all used to having it done. It's just a fixture. Well, where we were before the invention of the blood pressure cuff is where we are with regard to diet. Diet quality measured objectively, to take us back to the very beginning of our conversation, is the single leading predictor variable for premature death from all causes in the United States today. And it's measured in just about nobody. So we know that diet quality is a problem in general at the population level, just like we knew about blood pressure before the blood pressure cuff, but we don't measure it in anybody. And the way we know that your diet's broken is you develop obesity or type 2 diabetes or hypertension or dyslipidemia or all of the above. Just exactly the way the world was with blood pressure before the blood pressure cuff was invented. So this phase of my career took me from academic medicine to being an accidental entrepreneur because I invented a new way to assess diet. We can do it in 60 seconds. It's effortless. It's painless. It's even fun. It's over any digital interface. We don't need body specimens of any kind. You just play this game and we've got your diet in about 60 seconds. And we can generate a measure, the objective measure of your diet quality. So it's as easy to do as a blood pressure. So my argument is diet quality should be a vital sign. And what I would argue this administration can and should do is if you're really serious about making Americans healthier, again, or for the first time, and you want a preferential focus on diet, let's make diet quality objectively measured, not ideological, but just, whatever your kind of diet you have, we're going to measure using the best metric we've got. Let's make that universal as blood pressure. Let's get that in front of every person. So as a patient, we all know our diet quality the way we know our blood pressure and maybe our BMI and maybe our cholesterol. And in front of every healthcare professional. And then let's require that the healthcare professionals deal with this. If you can't deal with it yourself, make an appropriate referral. If you aren't educated in this area, get educated. We're going to start elevating the standard of clinical care so that every health professional has to be able to deal with this, because for health professionals not to be able to deal with the single leading predictor variable for all-cause mortality really seems like a pretty serious dereliction of duty, doesn't it? So it's time to adapt or die. So that's the change I would make. That change can be made. I think that would be transformational. And by the way, that would get at all these other subsidiary issues. So, the quality of fats in your diet figure in the score that you get for your overall diet quality. If you're eating more processed foods with artificial dyes and probably also bringing along for the ride excess sodium and sugar, that shows up in your diet quality. So if you fix the big picture, you fix the components of the big picture. If you fixate on some component, it's the famous case of, being diverted by the trees and not seeing the forest. So I would argue that the whole forest here is burning down, and we could focus attention on that by making diet quality a vital sign and an actionable cue to every patient and every healthcare professional.
Can I play you something?
Yes, please.
So this is related to the naturalistic fallacy.
Okay, let me see it.
Not methylene blue.
Okay.
And it's from my friend Paul Saladino.
Good buddy.
He has to make one appearance
Every
per
pod.
episode.
Yeah.
In actually, respect to him, he's come out and said methylene blue. He's not a proponent of methylene blue.
Okay.
Again, I haven't reviewed it, so I don't know. But he doesn't seem to have jumped on the bandwagon. But this I found interesting, and this is something that you'll hear quite a lot from people in the kind of low carb, animal based carnivore community. Turn up the volume.
Lubricant. This is the crazy history of canola oil. Canola oil is derived from the seeds of the rape plant. It's rapeseed oil, and it was originally developed in World War II to lubricate ships and steam engines because the oil sticks to wet metal. Now, during World...
Okay, so that claim you hear quite a lot, that seed oils or vegetable oils, like this stuff was used as engine, it was an engine lubricant.
Uh-huh.
And so how can this be fit for human consumption?
Right.
I would just say at that point, whether a food has utility in another area is kind of irrelevant. You just want to test that food in clinical trials and large scale observational epidemiology to see how it affects health outcomes. But let's just take this.
Okay.
Let's just take this logic at face value. Okay.
My favorite cooking fat is, drumroll please, tallow. Tallow is rendered beef fat. I didn't even know what tallow was until I was probably 30 or 40 years old. Tallow is rendered beef fat, which means you take the fat from a cow, the trim, the kidney fat, which is high in stearic acid, and you put it in a kettle and you render it and you end up with tallow. Why would you want to use tallow in your pan to cook with? This is important.
Anyway, so in this video, he talks about beef tallow being his favorite sort of cooking fat. So you have, on one hand, the story that vegetable oils have been used as engine lubricant, not good.
Right.
The other one is that beef tallow comes from an animal. It's good.
Natural.
The interesting thing that Paul is overlooking here is that tallow has been used as an engine lubricant as well. In fact, before canola, tallow, and I'm quoting off off a link. I'll put this in the show notes. Tallow can be used for the production of biodiesel in much the same way as oils from plants are currently used. Not only that, the United States Air Force has experimented successfully with the use of beef tallow in aviation biofuels during 5 days of flight testing from August 23rd to 27th, 2010 at Edwards Air Force Base, California.
Yeah.
Air Force C-17 Globemaster 3 flew using conventional jet fuel in 3 of its engines and a 50-50 blend of that and biofuel made from beef tallow in 1 engine.
Yeah, but Simon, that is the power of tallow. It can fuel a jet.
Exactly. See how you can flip the story?
And it can fuel my body.
But I could create a video right now on beef tallow just saying, anyone eating beef tallow, you guys are idiots. This is used to fuel aircrafts.
Right. Exactly. So what we should be doing is saying, what are the human outcomes, right?
Correct.
Are there studies looking at health outcomes in humans? Like, forget about the use case, forget about what it was designed for. Can it be consumed in a healthful way, and what are the effects?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's what it comes down to for almost anything. But yeah, right, like the logical inconsistency is wild. You should make a little reel about this and tag Paulie in. Love to hear
I
his
might try
response.
and collaborate. I'll suggest a collaboration.
Invite him
on
as
the
a
post.
collaborator. Please do that.
He won't accept.
No chance.
So looking forward, Bill, where do you think the missing gaps are? I think you mentioned earlier, you said, I don't think there's going to be any data that changes the mind of these individuals out there. Is there gaps in this research? Is there any type of study or question that you think should be asked that might help give people a little more confidence here?
Well, I think if we take the position of reality, we're not going to see a randomized trial of 10, 20, 30,000 people to 5, 6, 7, 10 years of consuming one low linoleic acid versus high linoleic acid. It's just, it ain't going to happen. Nobody's going to fund that. And so we're going to have to just put up with what we have for non-randomized trial studies. And so we're looking at observational data. So we are currently, as part of this coalition group that we've called the Force Group, we've looked at many, pooled the data from many, many different observational studies together. And we're doing one right now on, again, blood levels or tissue levels of omega-6 and total mortality and cancer mortality, cardiovascular. And that study is going to show the same thing as our study in the UK Biobank showed from the data I've seen so far. It's going to corroborate that completely. So to the extent that anybody's going to believe that biomarker-based, and when we say biomarker-based, I mean blood linoleic acid levels. The higher they are, the better cardiovascular, cancer, other causes of death. That's, I think, the kind of thing we can keep doing. Whether that is going to convince anybody when they've got their metabolic chart to gaze upon and they've got their in vitro or their animal study experiment that they want to, it's almost like a religion. I don't know why where it comes from, where this energy comes from against these oils. I just don't get it.
Right, and it's a valuing of mechanisms over the outcome data, and I think ultimately that I think what you'll publish, if it corroborates the current biomarker research out there, I think it's going to be have a positive impact in some way. But I think these people that have this kind of deep conviction about seed oils are likely just to come back and say healthy user bias again. We should just focus on the biochemistry and the mechanisms.
Yeah. I mean, the worst thing I saw part of in the video you sent me from Paul was he referred to a study that I was part of, which was one of these collaboration meta-analysis of multiple biomarker studies where we found it, and Jason Wu was the first author. And we found that higher levels of linoleic acid were associated with lower risk for developing type 2 diabetes over time. And all he had to say about it was, one of the authors, he said the study was funded by the seed oil industry, which is absolutely not true. It wasn't funded by anybody. One of the authors had consulted for Bunge, one of the seed oil companies, and he highlighted that author and that thing, and he said, therefore, don't believe anything this says. And that is just completely disingenuous. It presumes that people, science are lying to make money. And it's just not true. It's just not. I mean, there's 50 authors on this paper. One of them has this, consulted for this company once. And it doesn't mean he's biased for them. Doesn't mean the entire paper is. But that's as good as they can do to criticize these papers, is to find this kind of thing. It really aggravated me, frankly.
Do you think that the demonization of seed oils and I guess some of the changes that the government are beginning to make will have a damaging effect on public health?
Yes. Yeah. I think if the current, who knows what's going to happen with RFK and here in the United States, Secretary of Health, who's kind of against seed oils. I'd love to get his ear, and I'd love to have him listen to this podcast, but who knows? It would, if they follow through on their plans and do what Steak and Shake is doing, and in 1,000 different places they start removing vegetable oils from our food supply and going back to animal fats, we're simply going to increase our risk for cardiovascular events, cardiovascular disease. There's no question about it.
There you have it, friends. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did and want to stay up to date with future episodes, be sure to hit that subscribe button on YouTube and follow on Apple or Spotify. Finally, thank you for showing up and the effort that you're making to take control of your health. I look forward to hanging out with you again in the next episode.